My name is Haley, and I am 32 years old. At my daughter's wedding rehearsal, my own sister introduced me to her corporate boss as the family unemployed loser who leeches off a dead man's life insurance. I did not scream or cry. I just smiled politely. That same boss looked at me with pure terror, bowed his head respectfully, and then turned to my sister and told her she was fired immediately. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly endure the cruelty of toxic family members who grossly underestimated your worth. For the past 5 years, my family has treated me like a pathetic charity case, convinced that I spend my days lounging around in sweatpants while living off the insurance payout from my late husband. They have no idea that the money they constantly mock me for was locked into a trust for his daughter the day he died. They also have no idea that I spend my days secretly running a multi-million-dollar venture capital firm from my laptop. The air in the hallway of the Grand Plaza Hotel smelled heavily of expensive lilies and floor wax. It was the evening of the rehearsal dinner, the official kickoff to a wedding weekend that was supposed to be the happiest time in my stepdaughter Mia's life. At 20 years old, Mia was young to be getting married, but she and her college sweetheart had a bond that reminded me so much of what her father and I once shared. I had been raising Mia since she was 10 years old. When my husband David passed away 5 years ago, it left me as a 27-year-old widow tasked with solely guiding a grieving 15-year-old teenager into adulthood. Since that terrible day, Mia and I had been each other's entire world. I was kneeling on the thick carpet of the private hallway, just outside the main banquet room, carefully pinning a loose fold on the back of Mia's rehearsal dress. The soft ivory fabric had snagged on a chair earlier, and I wanted her to look absolutely flawless before we walked in to join her fiancé's family. Mia looked down at me with her eyes shining full of unshed tears and whispered that she wished her dad could be here. I squeezed her hand and told her he was watching over us, bursting with pride. It was a tender and quiet moment between a mother and daughter. Then the heavy mahogany double doors swung open with aggressive force, hitting the wall with a loud thud that made us both jump. My older sister Caroline marched into the hallway. At 34 years old, Caroline was a senior director at a massive financial firm in Chicago. She wore a sharp designer suit that probably cost more than my first car, and her face was twisted into a scowl of pure, unfiltered irritation. She did not greet Mia. She did not offer a compliment about how beautiful the bride looked. Instead, she marched straight toward a small decorative console table against the wall and violently slammed a thick, itemized invoice onto the polished wood. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet corridor. Mia shrank back instinctively, clutching the skirt of her dress. "Do you have any idea how much they are charging for the supplemental catering fees?" Caroline demanded, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I swear, Haley, you have absolutely zero financial sense. I am bleeding money trying to sponsor this ridiculous wedding because you cannot be bothered to get a real job." I slowly stood up, brushing the invisible lint from the knees of my simple black dress. I kept my voice incredibly calm, acutely aware of Mia's growing anxiety. "Caroline, the catering fees were already settled. I sent the venue a cashier's check last week. I do not need you to sponsor anything." Caroline let out a harsh, barking laugh that grated against my ears. "Oh, please, you sent a check. And what account did that come from, Haley? Let me guess. You are still draining David's life insurance policy to play the role of the generous mother. It makes me sick. You have been unemployed for 5 years. You sit at home all day doing absolutely nothing, dragging down the family name while the rest of us actually work for a living." Her words were designed to inflict maximum damage, precisely calibrated to hit every insecurity a young widow might have. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to feel utterly dependent on the perceived generosity of our family. Caroline had always been like this, constantly needing to step on my neck to make herself feel taller. Ever since David died, she treated me not as a grieving sister who stepped up to raise a child, but as a financial parasite. Mia stepped forward, her voice shaking but fiercely protective. "Aunt Caroline, stop it. My mom does everything for me. You do not know what you are talking about." "Do not use that tone with me, little girl," Caroline snapped, pointing a manicured finger at Mia. You are getting a luxury rehearsal dinner tonight because I pulled strings and swiped my corporate card to cover the overages your mother is too broke to handle. Both of you are living in a fantasy world. Haley is a jobless freeloader, and I am exhausted from constantly bailing her out so she can play pretend. I felt a surge of hot anger rising in my chest, a fierce desire to pull up my banking app right then and there and show her the massive balance in my holding account. I wanted to tell her that I owned Apex Holdings, the exact venture capital firm that was currently in the final stages of a hostile takeover of her entire corporate employer. I wanted to watch her arrogant face crumble into sheer panic, but I looked at Mia. I saw the tears spilling over her eyelashes, ruining the makeup we had spent an hour perfecting. This was the night before her wedding. She was about to walk into a room full of her future in-laws, and Caroline was intentionally destroying her joy just to feed a monstrous ego. If I unleashed my truth now, the entire weekend would become a media circus of family drama. The spotlight would completely shift from Mia's beautiful milestone to my financial dominance and Caroline's humiliation. I refused to let my sister steal my daughter's thunder, so I swallowed my pride. I took a deep breath, forcing the anger down into a tight, controlled box inside my chest. I looked Caroline dead in the eyes and offered a mild, apologetic smile. "You are right, Caroline," I said softly, my voice dripping with practiced submission. "I am sorry for the stress this has caused you. We appreciate everything you are doing for Mia tonight. Please let us just go inside and enjoy the dinner." Caroline smirked, clearly satisfied with my surrender. She adjusted the lapels of her expensive jacket, her eyes raking over my plain dress with undisguised disgust. "That is exactly what I thought," she muttered. "Try to look a little less pathetic when you mingle with the groom's parents. I do not want them thinking my firm associates with beggars." She turned on her heel and pushed back through the double doors, leaving a toxic cloud of tension in her wake. Mia grabbed my hand, sobbing quietly. "Mom, why do you let her talk to you like that? You are not a loser." I pulled my beautiful daughter into a warm embrace, smoothing her hair. "I know who I am, sweetheart," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "And trust me, by the end of this weekend, Caroline is going to know exactly who I am too. Right now, this is your night. We are not going to let anyone ruin it." I wiped away her tears and fixed her makeup, projecting nothing but calm reassurance. But beneath my quiet exterior, a storm was brewing. I knew my sister's cruelty would only escalate as the wedding events continued. I just had to bide my time, endure the incoming insults, and wait for the perfect moment to let the trap snap shut. We pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the warm glow of the banquet hall. The room was alive with the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the gentle hum of a jazz trio playing in the corner. Mia immediately brightened as her fiancé hurried over to pull her into his arms. I watched the tension melt from her shoulders and took a deep breath of my own. I plastered a serene smile on my face and began making my way toward the groom's family table. Before I could even reach out to shake hands with my future in-laws, a booming voice cut through the ambient noise of the room. Well, if it is not the woman of the hour finally making an appearance. I turned to see Jamal striding toward us. At 35 years old, Jamal was a highly successful corporate broker at the same financial firm where my sister worked. As an African-American man who had climbed the ruthless corporate ladder to earn his spot at the top, he exuded a level of aggressive confidence that demanded attention the moment he entered a room. Tonight, he was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, a gold Rolex gleaming on his wrist as he held a glass of expensive scotch. He bypassed me entirely and marched straight up to the groom's father, clapping the older man on the shoulder with a hearty, patronizing laugh. "We are just glad we could pull this whole thing together," Jamal announced, projecting his voice so that half the room could hear. "I was telling Caroline on the ride over here that sponsoring a wedding is no joke. But you know how it is. When family is struggling, you have to step up and open the checkbook." The groom's father, an incredibly kind and unassuming retired high school principal, shifted awkwardly. He looked from Jamal to me, his face tight with discomfort. "I thought Haley handled all the arrangements," he murmured politely. Jamal let out a loud, condescending chuckle and took a slow sip of his scotch. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure pity. Haley tries her best, bless her heart. But let us be real here. Being a single mother without a steady paycheck for half a decade takes its toll. Caroline and I just want to make sure the kids get a proper send-off without bankrupting the poor girl. You cannot exactly fund a luxury wedding on leftover life insurance and sheer willpower. We handle the heavy financial lifting, so Haley can just focus on taking pictures and looking pretty. The sheer audacity of his words felt like a physical strike. He was standing in a room paid for entirely by my private accounts, drinking top-shelf liquor that I had personally selected, and framing himself as my financial savior. The groom's mother looked absolutely horrified by the brazen disrespect, setting her wine glass down with a sharp clatter. I could see the anger flashing in Mia's eyes from across the room. She was ready to march over and start a screaming match that would undoubtedly end in a catastrophic scene. I caught my daughter's eye and gave her a subtle, firm shake of my head. I would not allow Jamal to turn her rehearsal dinner into a battleground. "You are too kind, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and my smile firmly in place. "We are all just so focused on celebrating the bride and groom tonight. Thank you for being here to support them." Jamal smirked, clearly taking my diplomatic response as an admission of defeat. He tapped his glass against mine. "Anytime, Haley. We just want to make sure you do not end up on the street after paying for the appetizers." He laughed at his own cruel joke and turned his attention back to the groom's parents, launching into an unsolicited lecture about his latest stock market conquests. I stood there for a few moments longer, enduring the suffocating atmosphere of his inflated ego. The air in the banquet hall suddenly felt unbearably thick. The fake smiles, the biting comments, the constant need to swallow my pride for the sake of peace were starting to suffocate me. I needed a moment of absolute silence. I needed to step away before I lost my composure and did something that would ruin Mia's night. Excusing myself from the table, I slipped out a side door that led to a secluded garden terrace. The cool night air hit my face instantly, clearing the fog of anger from my mind. I walked down a narrow stone path lined with tall, manicured hedges, breathing deeply and reminding myself of the bigger picture. My wealth management assistant had been trying to reach me all day regarding the final acquisition papers for Apex Financial. The power to dismantle Caroline and Jamal's entire corporate existence was literally sitting in my inbox. I just needed to maintain my cover until the wedding ceremony was complete. As I rounded the corner of a large stone fountain, I heard a sharp, familiar voice drifting from an open window near the venue's administrative offices. It was Caroline. She sounded furious, and she was not trying to hide it. "I do not care what the original contract says." Caroline snapped her heels, clicking aggressively against the tile floor inside. "I am telling you to cancel the imported orchids and the fresh garden roses immediately." I froze, stepping closer to the shadows of the hedges to listen. Through the slightly parted blinds, I could see Caroline cornering the venue's lead event coordinator. The poor manager was holding a clipboard, looking completely frantic. "But ma'am," the manager stammered nervously, "the bride specifically requested those floral arrangements months ago. The shipment is already secured in our climate-controlled storage for tomorrow morning. If we cancel them now, we have to replace them with whatever we have on hand, which is mostly synthetic silk and plastic displays. It will completely alter the aesthetic of the grand ballroom." "That is exactly what you are going to do," Caroline demanded, crossing her arms over her chest. "Listen to me very carefully. My sister Haley is a complete fraud. She has been unemployed for 5 years and is living in a total fantasy world. She has absolutely no way to pay the final invoice for those ridiculous luxury flowers tomorrow. If you put those fresh arrangements out, your venue is going to eat the cost because the unemployed widow is going to default on the payment." The manager swallowed hard, clearly intimidated by Caroline's aggressive corporate posturing. But the deposit was already paid in full. "And that is all the money she has left?" Caroline sneered. "I am doing you a favor by intervening. Swap the fresh flowers for the cheap plastic ones. If anyone asks, just say there was a supply chain issue with the distributor. Haley will not have the spine to argue with you, and she certainly will not have the funds to threaten legal action." Do it now before you lose thousands of dollars on a charity case. I stood frozen in the cool darkness of the garden, my hands curled into tight fists at my sides. It was one thing for my sister to insult my financial status to my face. It was one thing for her husband to belittle me in front of my new family. I had thick skin, and I could take their pathetic jabs. But actively sabotaging my daughter's wedding day, intentionally stripping away the beautiful details Mia had dreamed of simply to feed a sick, twisted narrative of superiority. My heart hammered against my ribs with a cold, calculating rhythm. Caroline was so desperate to prove that I was a destitute failure that she was willing to ruin Mia's perfect day. She thought she held all the cards. She thought she was the apex predator in the room, manipulating the venue staff with her aggressive corporate intimidation tactics. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the anger crystallize into absolute focus. I pulled my phone from my clutch, staring at the unread message from my executive team regarding the buyout of her firm. I was not going to stop the venue manager from making the changes tonight. I was going to let Caroline believe her cruel little sabotage had worked perfectly. I was going to let her walk into the wedding tomorrow feeling like the undisputed queen of our family. She wanted to play God with my daughter's happiness because she thought I was powerless to stop her. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the banquet hall, my mind entirely made up. The time for biting my tongue was over. Tomorrow the plastic flowers would be the least of Caroline's worries. The morning of the wedding dawned with a crisp and brilliant blue sky, casting a golden light over the city skyline. I woke up with a fierce determination settling deep into my bones. The anger from the previous night had condensed into a sharp and terrifying clarity. I was no longer the grieving widow trying to keep the peace. I was a mother preparing to go to war for her daughter. But first I had a promise to fulfill. Before leaving my house, I opened the heavy steel safe hidden in my home office and extracted a worn midnight blue velvet box. Inside rested a breathtaking diamond and sapphire teardrop pendant attached to a delicate platinum chain. It had belonged to David's grandmother, and it was the exact piece of jewelry he had always dreamed of clasping around Mia's neck on her wedding day. Running my fingers over the cool stones, I made a silent vow to David that I would protect our girl's joy today no matter what it took. I arrived at the grand downtown hotel just before 9 in the morning, holding the velvet box tightly inside my handbag. The lobby was a bustling hive of activity with bellhops pushing brass luggage carts and early guests sipping espresso. The venue was spectacular, boasting marble floors and towering crystal chandeliers that caught the morning light. I bypassed the main reception desk and headed straight for the private elevators designated for the penthouse levels. Mia and her bridesmaids had been booked into the premier VIP bridal suite at the end of the top floor. It was a massive, beautiful space featuring panoramic windows and a private terrace, supposedly the perfect place for a young bride to get her hair and makeup done in absolute peace. As the elevator doors parted with a soft chime on the penthouse level, I stepped out onto the plush carpet, eager to see Mia's excited face. I had a whole speech prepared about how beautiful she was going to look and how proud her father would be. But as I rounded the corner toward the double doors of the bridal suite, my footsteps slowed to a complete halt. There, scattered carelessly in the middle of the public hallway, was a chaotic pile of luggage. I blinked, staring at the mess in sheer confusion. A monogrammed pink duffel bag was tossed unceremoniously against the patterned wallpaper. Several clear plastic cosmetic cases were stacked haphazardly on top of it. A bridesmaid dress, still wrapped in its protective plastic cover, was draped over a discarded room service tray cart. Next to it lay a pair of white satin bridal sneakers that I had personally bought for Mia just 3 weeks ago. My heart leapt into my throat. These were Mia's belongings. Her entire bridal preparation kit had been evicted and dumped into the corridor like actual trash. Panic surged through my veins. I rushed forward, frantically scanning the hallway for any sign of my daughter. The double doors to the VIP suite were closed, but I could hear a loud, steady hum of voices radiating from inside. It was not the high-pitched, excited chatter of bridesmaids getting their hair curled. It sounded like the deep, booming echoes of a crowded bar. I reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the heavy door, pushing it open with force. I barely made it one step across the threshold before a solid, immovable wall of a chest blocked my path. I looked up and found myself staring directly into the smug face of Jamal. He was dressed in another immaculate tailored suit, a sleek silver tie knotted perfectly at his throat. He held a ceramic cup of black coffee in one hand, and he immediately shifted his stance to fill the doorframe, using his broad shoulders to physically barricade me from entering. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of the bridal suite. It was unrecognizable. The plush white sofas where Mia was supposed to be relaxing were occupied by men in dark suits, holding leather portfolios. The mimosa cart I had ordered for the girls had been commandeered and replaced by an array of Scotch bottles and imported cigars. Caroline was standing near the terrace windows laughing loudly while gesturing toward the city skyline surrounded by a captivated audience of middle-aged men. They had turned the bridal suite into a corporate boardroom. Jamal looked down at me, his eyes cold and devoid of any basic human decency. He did not move an inch. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, looking thoroughly annoyed by my presence. "What do you think you are doing, Jamal?" I demanded, keeping my voice low but laced with absolute fury. "Where is Mia? Why are her things thrown into the public hallway like garbage?" Jamal took a slow, arrogant sip of his coffee. "Relax, Haley," he sneered, lowering his voice so his guests would not hear. "Do not come in here making a hysterical scene. Caroline had a brilliant idea last night. Some of the top executives from our firm flew in this morning for the wedding, and they needed a private place to gather before the main events start. The bridal suite has the best square footage and the most impressive view in the entire hotel. It is perfect for high-level networking." I stared at him in complete disbelief. "You hijacked my daughter's bridal suite for a networking mixer on the morning of her wedding. Are you out of your mind? Move out of my way right now." I tried to step around him, but Jamal smoothly shifted his weight, intentionally bumping his shoulder against mine to force me back into the hallway. His expression hardened, dropping the fake polite smirk. "Listen to me very carefully," he hissed, leaning down so we were face to face. "The men in that room control billions of dollars in assets. They hold my future and Caroline's future in the palms of their hands. We are not going to squander a prime networking opportunity just so a 20-year-old kid can sit around in a bathrobe and put on lip gloss." We moved her bags out to make room for people who actually matter. I gripped the strap of my handbag, my knuckles turning white. "You are sick," I whispered. "Where did you send the bride on her wedding day?" Jamal rolled his eyes as if I were being entirely unreasonable. "She went downstairs to find some other place to get ready. Probably a public restroom or something. She will survive. And frankly, you need to leave too." He stepped back, beginning to pull the heavy double doors closed right in my face. "You are a walking disaster, Haley," he sneered through the narrowing gap. "Look at you. You have not worked a day in 5 years and you reek of desperation. Do not embarrass us by lingering around the penthouse. Go sit down in the lobby with the catering staff and the rest of the hired help. I will text you when it is time to come out and take your little family pictures." Before I could utter another word, Jamal pulled the doors firmly shut. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the quiet hallway. I stood there alone, staring at the polished wood of the closed door, surrounded by my daughter's discarded belongings. The sheer level of their entitlement was breathtaking. Caroline and Jamal were so blinded by their own corporate greed and so utterly convinced of my helplessness that they genuinely believed they could treat us like dirt without any consequences. I looked down at the velvet box hidden in my bag containing a priceless family heirloom, and then looked at the locked door protecting my sister and her oblivious executives. They thought they were impressing the most powerful people in the world. They had absolutely no idea that the real power was standing right outside their door, quietly preparing to burn their entire empire to the ground. The sharp ding of the penthouse elevator dragged my attention away from the locked double doors. I turned to see my parents stepping out onto the plush carpet. My mother wore a pristine silver pantsuit, her hair sprayed into an immaculate helmet of blonde waves. My father trailed a step behind her, adjusting his tie with a look of vague detachment. For a brief second, a wave of relief washed over me. Surely they would put a stop to this madness. Surely my mother, the woman who had fussed over every detail of my own childhood milestones, would be outraged to see her granddaughter's bridal suite commandeered and her belongings tossed into the hallway like unwanted charity donations. Mom. I started stepping over a fallen makeup bag to reach her. Caroline and Jamal just locked us out. They moved all of Mia's things into the corridor and took over the suite for some kind of corporate networking event. They told Mia to go find a public bathroom. I expected shock. I expected my mother to march up to those mahogany doors and demand entry. Instead, she stopped short and surveyed the pile of luggage with an expression of profound irritation. Her eyes darted from Mia's discarded wedding shoes to my face, and her lips thinned into a hard line of disapproval. Haley. Please lower your voice, my mother hissed, glancing nervously toward the other end of the hall, as if my distress was somehow offending the wallpaper. Do not make a fuss right now. Caroline texted me earlier to say Mr. Harrington and the senior partners were flying in. This is a massive opportunity for her career. I stared at her, feeling the last shred of my familial loyalty disintegrate. A massive opportunity. Mom, this is Mia's wedding morning. I paid for this suite specifically so she could have a peaceful, beautiful place to get ready with her bridesmaids. My father finally chimed in, waving a dismissive hand. It is just a room, Haley. Caroline is dealing with high-level executives, people who actually run the economy. You have all the time in the world to play dress-up, but your sister has real responsibilities to manage. You need to be more understanding of the pressure she is under. My mother nodded in vigorous agreement, stepping carefully around Mia's bridal gown to avoid wrinkling her own outfit. Exactly. Caroline is hosting people who could double her salary by next quarter. You know she carries a heavy financial burden for this family. The least you can do is let her use the space for an hour without throwing a tantrum. Just gather these things and go downstairs. I am sure there is a perfectly fine restroom near the lobby. Do not be so dramatic and ruin your sister's morning. Without another word, they bypassed me completely. My mother knocked gently on the double doors, smoothing her silver jacket and calling out Caroline's name in a sweet melodic tone. I watched as the door opened just enough to let them inside before shutting firmly in my face once again. They had chosen. They always chose Caroline. But to actively participate in the humiliation of a 20-year-old bride on her wedding day was an entirely new low. I gathered Mia's bags, hoisting the heavy garment bag over my shoulder and grabbing the cosmetic cases with my free hand. The descent to the ground floor felt like the longest elevator ride of my life. When the doors opened to the bustling hotel lobby, I navigated through throngs of arriving guests and busy catering staff searching for the public restrooms. I found Mia in the large ladies' room near the grand ballroom. The space was clean and lined with mirrors, but bathed in harsh, sterile fluorescent lighting that washed out all the natural warmth in the room. Mia was sitting on a small cushioned stool near the sinks, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. The beautiful silk robe we had bought for her to wear while getting ready was draped awkwardly over her lap. I dropped the bags and rushed to her side, pulling her into my arms. I let her cry against my shoulder, ignoring the curious glances of female hotel guests walking in and out of the stalls. It was deeply humiliating. We had paid for a luxury experience, and here we were huddled next to paper towel dispensers and automatic hand dryers because my sister needed to impress her boss. "Mom, they just kicked me out," Mia cried, her voice cracking. "Jamal said I was in the way. He told me to take my cheap makeup and go. Why do they hate us so much?" "They do not hate us, sweetie," I murmured, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "They are just empty people who need to step on others to feel tall. But I promise you this is the very last time they will ever make you cry. We are going to get you ready right here, and you are going to look more beautiful than any bride this hotel has ever seen." I unpacked her cosmetic bags, spreading brushes and palettes across the marble counter next to the automated soap dispensers. I plugged her curling iron into an outlet near the sinks. We worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic hum of the hand dryers providing a stark contrast to the classical music we had planned to play in the penthouse. I carefully applied her foundation, blending it perfectly under the unforgiving lights. I pinned her hair up, weaving small pearl clips into the delicate curls. As I wiped the last stray smudge of mascara from beneath her lower lash line, a sudden deep sense of calm washed over me. The anger that had been boiling in my chest all morning settled into a cold, hard resolve. Caroline had taken the sweet. My parents had taken her side. Jamal had insulted our dignity, but they had absolutely no idea that their entire world was resting in the palm of my hand. Just as I reached for Mia's setting spray, my phone vibrated intensely inside my pocket. I pulled it out, keeping one eye on Mia as she adjusted her veil in the mirror. The screen lit up with an urgent message from Arthur, the lead wealth management director at my venture capital firm. I tapped the notification, opening the encrypted messaging app we used for high-level corporate communications. Madam Chairman, the text read. The acquisition of Caroline's firm Apex Financial is legally finalized. The ink is dry, and all asset transfers have been verified by the board. You are now the majority stakeholder and supreme executive of the entire corporate group. Shall we terminate her today? I stared at the glowing letters on the screen. The power to destroy everything Caroline and Jamal valued was sitting right there waiting for my command. I could send one single word, and Arthur would dispatch an email that would freeze their corporate accounts, revoke their building access, and strip them of their prestigious titles before the wedding ceremony even began. I pictured Caroline sipping champagne in the stolen bridal suite, bragging to the very executives who now worked for me. I pictured Jamal boasting about his wealth while physically blocking a young bride from her own room. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard. It would be so easy to end it right now. But a swift termination behind closed doors was not enough. They had chosen to humiliate me and my daughter in public. They had built their entire toxic egos around this specific event, parading their perceived superiority in front of our family and friends. Ripping that away over a quiet email would be a mercy they simply did not deserve. I looked up at Mia. She was smiling at her reflection, the tears finally gone, her resilience shining through the gorgeous makeup. She was ready. I looked back down at my phone. I typed out my response with steady, deliberate keystrokes. Wait, let us see how far she goes. I hit send and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I turned to my daughter, holding out my hand. Come on, beautiful, I said softly. Let us go get you married. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of bittersweet tears and profound love. Watching Mia walk down the aisle wearing a dress we had chosen together, her eyes locked on a young man who absolutely adored her, made every ounce of my forced restraint worth it. I sat in the front pew, smiling through the ceremony, letting the joy of the moment wash over me. But as the afternoon faded into evening and the guests transitioned into the grand ballroom for the reception, the delicate peace we had managed to maintain began to fracture. The atmosphere inside the reception hall was beautiful, but undeniably tense. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the tables, but my eyes immediately caught the synthetic sheen of the centerpieces. True to her threat, Caroline had bullied the staff into replacing the lush, fresh floral arrangements Mia had carefully selected with cheap plastic alternatives. The stiff, lifeless petals stood as a glaring monument to my sister's petty cruelty. I caught Mia glancing at them as she and her new husband took their seats at the sweetheart table. A brief shadow crossed her face, but she squeezed her groom's hand and bravely kept her smile intact. I promised myself right then that I would buy her a greenhouse full of real orchids the moment this weekend was over. I was seated at the primary family table alongside the groom's parents, who were warm, wonderful people. However, they were clearly bewildered by the bizarre social dynamics unfolding around them. Instead of sitting with the family, Caroline and Jamal had effectively segregated themselves. They had commandeered two large tables near the front of the room, far too close to the bride and groom, strictly reserving them for the high-level executives from their financial firm. It was a wedding reception, yet my sister was treating it like a corporate retreat. She was practically vibrating with aggressive energy, darting between the chairs of her VIP guests, pouring drinks, and laughing a little too loudly at jokes that were not funny. Jamal was equally obnoxious, loosening his silver tie and loudly boasting about market shares and offshore accounts to anyone trapped in his vicinity. They were treating my daughter's wedding as nothing more than a lavish backdrop for their own professional advancement. I sat quietly picking at my catered chicken and making polite conversation with the groom's mother. Every so often, Caroline would shoot a triumphant, condescending glare in my direction, clearly reveling in her perceived dominance. She thought she had completely broken my spirit by kicking Mia out of the bridal suite and ruining the flowers. She thought I was sitting there, a helpless, unemployed widow entirely at her mercy. I took a slow sip of my water, feeling the cool weight of my phone in my pocket. The secret I harbored about Apex Holdings kept my heart beating at a steady, measured pace. I was holding a royal flush, but the game was not quite over yet. The reception progressed into the early evening. The jazz band played softly, and guests began to migrate toward the dance floor. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of hundreds of conversations filled the vast space. I was just about to excuse myself to check on Mia when a sudden erratic movement caught my eye. The lead venue manager, the same man I had seen cowering before Caroline in the hallway the previous night, was weaving his way through the crowded tables. He was heading straight for me. His face was slick with sweat, his breathing shallow and rapid, and his eyes darted nervously around the room, as if he expected someone to leap out and attack him. In his trembling hands, he clutched a thick black leather folio. He stopped at the edge of the family table, hovering awkwardly. The groom's parents paused their pleasant conversation, looking up at the distressed man with polite concern. I placed my linen napkin on my lap and gave him a reassuring smile, trying to put him at ease despite his obvious panic. "Is everything all right?" I asked gently, keeping my voice low so as not to draw unwanted attention from the surrounding tables. The manager swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight collar. "Ma'am, I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt your evening," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you paid the final catering invoice in full last week, and I assure you we do not usually conduct business during the reception itself. But a rather substantial addition was just made to the final ledger, and the hotel policy requires an immediate signature and card authorization for sudden charges of this magnitude." I frowned, slightly confused but maintaining my polite demeanor. "In addition, we finalized the menu and the open bar tab weeks ago. There should not be any new charges tonight." The manager opened the leather folio with visibly shaking fingers and slid a revised, freshly printed invoice across the white tablecloth. It stopped right next to my dinner plate. I looked down at the bold black ink at the bottom of the page. The total was staggering: $15,000. I stared at the number, doing a quick mental calculation. The open bar we had established was generous, but it certainly did not warrant a sudden $15,000 spike within the first 2 hours of the reception. I looked from the paper back up to the manager's terrified eyes. "What exactly is this massive charge for?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly calm, despite the sheer absurdity of the bill. The manager wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "It is for a premium vintage wine upgrade, ma'am. 10 bottles of a highly exclusive imported Bordeaux from our private cellar." "I did not order any vintage Bordeaux," I stated plainly. "I know you did not, ma'am," he replied, looking absolutely miserable. "Your sister Caroline bypassed the wedding planner entirely. She came straight to the hotel's master sommelier 20 minutes ago and demanded we pull our most expensive reserve stock from the cellar. She insisted they be served exclusively to her 2 specific tables where her corporate guests are seated." The absolute audacity of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Caroline had ordered $15,000 worth of elite wine just to impress her boss and his colleagues, treating my daughter's wedding budget like a limitless corporate expense account. "And what did she say when you asked for payment?" I asked, my tone turning dangerously quiet. The manager looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He glanced nervously over his shoulder toward Caroline's table before looking back at me. "She refused to provide a card, ma'am. She told me to bring the invoice directly to you. She explicitly said that the bride's mother will foot the bill and that I should not bother her with the trivial details of payment." I slowly looked up from the leather folio. Across the dimly lit ballroom, I saw Caroline watching me. She was holding a crystal glass filled with dark, rich vintage wine. She raised the glass a fraction of an inch in my direction, a cold, predatory smirk stretching across her face. She had intentionally manufactured a public financial crisis, assuming I would have a complete panic attack over a bill I supposedly could not afford. She wanted me to break down in front of the groom's wealthy family. She wanted to prove once and for all that I was exactly the pathetic broke loser she claimed I was. She thought she had me trapped in an impossible corner. But she was dead wrong. I stared back at Caroline, refusing to break eye contact. The dark red liquid swirling in her crystal goblet caught the light of the chandeliers, matching the triumphant flush on her cheeks. She was waiting for the inevitable collapse. She wanted the tears, the frantic whispering, the desperate pleas for financial assistance in front of the groom's esteemed family. Beside me, the groom's mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair, sensing the thick tension radiating across the ballroom. She leaned in, her voice filled with genuine, gentle concern, offering to quietly cover the sudden expense to avoid a scene. I placed my hand softly over hers, giving her a reassuring squeeze, and politely shook my head. I had no intention of letting anyone else fight my battles. Caroline, noticing the distinct lack of a meltdown, decided she needed to force the issue. The quiet humiliation was not enough for her. She craved a public spectacle. Setting her wineglass down on the crisp white linen of her VIP table, she pushed her chair back and stood up. The fabric of her designer gown rustled loudly in the sudden lull of the jazz music. "Is there a problem over there with the invoice?" Haley Caroline called out. She intentionally projected her voice so it carried clearly over the gentle hum of the reception. Several heads turned in our direction. The executives at her table paused their conversations, turning their collective gaze toward me. "I see the manager brought you the bill for the reserve, Bordeaux." Caroline continued, taking a few steps away from her table to ensure the entire front half of the ballroom was an unwilling audience to her grandstand. "I know $15,000 is a staggering amount of money for someone in your current situation, but my colleagues and I are accustomed to a certain standard of hospitality. I told the staff that you would handle the final tab, but by the look on your face, I can see you are completely out of your depth." Jamal, seated at the adjacent table, let out a booming theatrical sigh and reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. He pulled out a sleek leather wallet, shaking his head with a perfectly practiced look of pity. "Do not worry about it, Haley," Jamal announced, his voice echoing Caroline's condescending volume. "We knew you were going to be in over your head with a venue like this. I have my corporate card right here. Caroline and I are more than happy to save the day again. We cannot have the bride's mother defaulting on the catering bill in front of her new in-laws. Just hand the invoice over to the adults and we will take care of the heavy lifting." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over our section of the room. The groom's parents looked absolutely mortified by the brazen, tasteless display of wealth and arrogance. From the sweetheart table, I saw Mia stiffen, her beautiful face flashing with fresh humiliation as guests began to whisper. Caroline stood tall, her chin raised, soaking in the attention like a spotlight. She had painted me exactly as she wanted me to be seen, a helpless, destitute charity case, relying on her wealthy, powerful sister to keep from drowning. I did not break eye contact with Caroline. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of the righteous fury burning through my veins. Instead, I turned my attention back to the trembling venue manager, who was still hovering next to my chair, looking as though he might faint from the sheer awkwardness of the situation. "You may process the charge for the wine," I said, my voice perfectly level and entirely unbothered. "And please add a generous gratuity for the waitstaff dealing with that particular table." I reached into my evening clutch. My fingers bypassed the standard bank cards and located the heavy, solid metal card resting in the back pocket. I pulled it out and placed it gently on top of the black leather folio. The card landed on the table with a distinct, solid thud. It was not plastic. It was a solid piece of anodized titanium, pitch black, and completely devoid of any raised numbers or flashy bank logos. The American Express Centurion card. the legendary black card issued by invitation only to individuals whose net worth and spending habits resided in the top fraction of the 1%. The venue manager looked down. His eyes widened to the size of saucers. He inhaled sharply, instantly recognizing the weight and significance of the metal resting on his invoice. All of his nervous, frantic energy vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, terrified reverence. "Right away, ma'am," he whispered, his voice trembling for an entirely different reason now. He picked up the card as if it were a fragile, historical artifact, bowed his head deeply, and practically sprinted away to process the transaction. Across the room, Caroline's victorious smirk faltered. She had seen the card. She had heard the distinct, heavy sound it made against the table. She squinted, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. Her brain was violently rejecting the information her eyes were processing. She leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better look at what I had just handed to the manager. To a corporate climber like Caroline the Centurion, card was the ultimate unattainable status symbol. But seeing one emerge from the purse of her unemployed, widowed sister created a short circuit in her reality. "What was that?" Caroline demanded, her voice losing its theatrical projection and dropping into a sharp, genuine hiss of confusion. "What did you just give him? Is that some kind of prepaid debit card?" She took a step toward my table, her posture rigid, her need to investigate overriding her desire to maintain her sophisticated poise. She was about to demand answers, to rip away the serene smile I was directing at her, but she never got the chance. Before she could close the distance between us, a loud, commanding noise echoed through the grand ballroom. The heavy, towering oak doors at the main entrance of the reception hall swung open with a resounding crash. The sudden noise startled the jazz trio, causing the saxophone player to miss a beat and bringing the gentle background music to an abrupt halt. Every head in the room, including Caroline's and Jamal's, snapped toward the entrance. A group of men stepped over the threshold, moving in absolute synchronized unison. They were not wedding guests. They wore sharp, austere, dark suits that screamed corporate enforcement. Their expressions were stone cold, their eyes scanning the room with calculating precision. They carried thick leather briefcases and moved with a terrifying, undeniable authority that instantly sucked the air out of the room. As they marched straight down the center aisle, bypassing the confused guests and heading directly toward the VIP tables, the entire dynamic of the evening shifted on its axis. The heavy silence in the room shattered as the men marched down the center aisle. There were 6 of them in total, radiating an intimidating aura of absolute corporate authority. Leading the pack was Arthur, the senior managing director of the venture capital firm I now officially controlled. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his piercing gray eyes scanned the ballroom with a predatory calmness. I had not explicitly invited them to the reception, but Arthur was a thorough man. He knew exactly where the newly acquired assets were currently congregating. Caroline stopped dead in her tracks, her manicured hand flying to her mouth in a theatrical gasp. The confusion over the solid titanium card on my table evaporated instantly from her mind, entirely eclipsed by the sudden arrival of the most powerful men in her industry. These were the elite board members of Apex Financial's parent holding company, men who resided so high up the corporate food chain that Caroline had likely only ever seen them in quarterly newsletters or distant shareholder meetings. Her posture shifted in a fraction of a second. The sneering, condescending bully vanished, replaced instantly by a fawning, desperate sycophant. She grabbed Jamal by the arm, her fingernails practically digging into his expensive suit jacket, and yanked him forward. She abandoned her VIP tables, abandoned our standoff, and practically sprinted across the polished dance floor to intercept them. "Mr. Harrington," Caroline breathed, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet reverence. "What an absolute honor. We had no idea the executive board would be gracing us with their presence tonight. Please come in. We have a private table and reserve wine waiting just for you." Arthur paused, his imposing figure towering over my sister. He did not immediately respond. Instead, his sharp gray eyes flicked over Caroline's shoulder, meeting my gaze across the dimly lit room. For a singular, imperceptible second, he waited for my command. I gave him the slightest, almost invisible nod, keeping my face perfectly composed. It was the silent confirmation of the directive I had texted him minutes earlier. Let her play her hand. Arthur turned his attention back to Caroline, offering a tight, unreadable smile. We were in the city finalizing a major acquisition, he stated smoothly, his voice deep and resonant. We thought it prudent to make an appearance where the current leadership of Apex Financial was gathered. Caroline practically vibrated with triumphant energy, entirely misinterpreting his words as a profound compliment. She took his vague statement as confirmation that they had come specifically to celebrate her, to acknowledge her value to the firm. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, born of pure narcissism. Jamal stepped forward, immediately shifting into his aggressive networking mode. He enthusiastically pumped the hands of men who looked at him with veiled disdain, loudly introducing himself and offering to escort them to the bar. Within seconds, Caroline and Jamal had effectively hijacked the entire flow of the wedding reception. Caroline snapped her fingers at the venue coordinator, demanding that the jazz band stop playing their romantic set and switch to something more upbeat and sophisticated for her guests. The wedding itinerary was completely abandoned. The scheduled father-daughter dance was pushed aside. The cake cutting was forgotten. Instead, Caroline guided the 6 elite executives directly onto the center of the dance floor, treating the heart of my daughter's reception like a convention center lobby. Jamal began pulling out thick embossed business cards, aggressively handing them out to the groomsmen and anyone else who walked past, loudly discussing fourth-quarter projections and offshore tax shelters. But the absolute pinnacle of their disrespect occurred near the grand staircase. The floral archway had been specifically set up for the official family portraits. Mia and her new husband were standing there holding hands and waiting patiently for the photographer to adjust his lighting umbrellas. Mia looked exhausted, but hopeful, clearly eager to capture the beautiful moment with her new family. Caroline swept into the space like a hurricane. She literally waved her hand at the bride and groom, making a shooing motion as if they were loitering teenagers. Mia's sweetheart Caroline announced loudly, projecting her voice so the executives would hear her taking charge. We are going to need this area for a few minutes. The lighting here is perfect, and I need to get some professional corporate shots with the board of directors for the firm's next press release. Just step aside for a bit. You can take your little pictures later. Mia froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was her wedding day. She was wearing a custom bridal gown, standing in a venue her mother had paid for, and her aunt was physically evicting her from her own photo session to take corporate headshots. The groom stepped forward, his jaw clenched, ready to defend his wife, but Mia gently pulled him back, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I started to push my chair back, the fury in my chest threatening to boil over, but what happened next paralyzed me with a profound, sickening sorrow. My parents, who had been sitting quietly at the family table, suddenly realized who had just walked into the room. They recognized the aura of extreme wealth and absolute power radiating from the executives. Instead of rushing over to defend their granddaughter, instead of putting Caroline in her place, my mother and father stood up and hurried directly toward the floral archway to join the corporate spectacle. My mother smoothed her silver hair, her face breaking into a massive, eager smile as she approached Arthur and the other board members. She bypassed Mia entirely, not even offering the bride a passing glance. It is so wonderful to meet the men Caroline works with. My mother gushed aggressively, inserting herself into the group. We are just so incredibly proud of her. She is the absolute backbone of this family, you know, always handling the heavy responsibilities. We are just thrilled you could make it to her little networking event. My father was right beside her, eagerly shaking hands with men he did not know, puffing out his chest and attempting to engage them in conversations about his old, outdated investment portfolios. They were fawning over the executives, desperately trying to elevate their own social standing by basking in the glow of Caroline's perceived corporate dominance. They completely ignored Mia. They abandoned the bride on her wedding day to seek the approval of wealthy strangers. I watched my daughter retreat to the shadows near the catering doors. A single tear tracked down her cheek, ruining the foundation I had so carefully applied in the public restroom. The groom wrapped his arms around her, glaring daggers at my family. The air in the ballroom felt toxic, polluted by the overwhelming greed and narcissism of the people who shared my blood. My parents had made their final choice. They had sold out their own granddaughter for a fleeting moment of social validation. I stood up slowly from the table. The time for waiting was over. I smoothed the front of my dress, my eyes locked on Caroline as she posed proudly beneath the floral archway, surrounded by the executives she thought she served. I walked purposefully across the ballroom, every step echoing with the finality of an executioner. It was time to show them exactly who owned the ground they were standing on. I crossed the polished hardwood of the dance floor, my heels clicking in a slow and rhythmic cadence that somehow cut through the ambient chatter of the ballroom. The distance between my table and the floral archway felt like miles, but every single step solidified my resolve. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, the remaining guests acutely aware that a massive line had just been crossed. The gentle jazz music floating from the stage felt entirely out of place against the sheer suffocating tension rolling off my family's improvised networking event. I looked away from the corporate spectacle for just a moment to find my daughter. Mia was standing near the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, her stunning white gown looking stark and vulnerable against the industrial stainless steel backdrop. Her shoulders were trembling. The quiet, brave dignity she had maintained all morning through the eviction from her suite and the sabotage of her flowers was finally crumbling. She buried her face against her new husband's shoulder, her tears leaving damp patches on his dark suit jacket. He held her fiercely glaring at the archway, with a clenched jaw powerless against the hurricane of my family's narcissism. Seeing my daughter, the bride, reduced to weeping in a service corridor, while her aunt and grandparents commandeered her designated photo area was a visual I would never forgive. I reached Mia and placed a gentle, steadying hand on her back. She looked up, her mascara perfectly intact, thanks to the waterproof setting spray we had applied in the lobby restroom, but her eyes were red and brimming with absolute heartbreak. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the day. "They took the suite. They ruined the centerpieces. And now they will not even let us take our wedding pictures. Why are they doing this today? Because they are small and desperate people." I told her softly, my voice completely devoid of the panic or subservience my family had always expected of me. "But this stops right now. Dry your eyes, sweetheart. You are the bride. This is your kingdom today." I squeezed her groom's arm, giving him a firm nod of reassurance. "Give me exactly 30 seconds and that archway will be entirely yours." I turned away from my daughter and faced the grand staircase. Underneath the cascading, albeit synthetic white roses, Caroline was in her absolute element. She was aggressively directing the hired wedding photographer, pointing and gesturing to arrange the 6 newly arrived executives into a power formation. My parents were hovering just out of frame, beaming with pathetic, fawning pride, completely oblivious to the weeping bride they had casually shoved aside to make room for these strangers. Jamal was adjusting his silver cuffs, grinning like a man who had just conquered the globe, standing shoulder to shoulder with men who clearly viewed him as an annoying, overeager gnat. In the absolute center of the formation stood a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a sharp-tailored charcoal suit. Mr. Harrington, the CEO of Apex Financial. He looked slightly bewildered by the aggressive impromptu photo session, but maintained a polite professional smile for the cameras. Beside him stood Arthur, his piercing gray eyes tracking my approach with the silent, calculating patience of a sniper waiting for the final signal. I stepped directly into the camera's line of sight, intentionally ruining Caroline's perfectly orchestrated corporate shot. The photographer lowered his heavy lens with a confused frown. Caroline's triumphant smile instantly morphed into a snarl of sheer, unadulterated venom. She dropped her hands to her sides, her eyes flashing with a violent mix of shock and rage that I had dared to interrupt her crowning achievement. "Excuse me," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the designated photo area. I did not look at my furious sister or my gasping parents. I addressed the men in the dark suits, directly, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "Gentlemen, I hope you are enjoying the reception. However, this specific area was reserved and paid for to capture the official family portraits of the bride and groom. They are currently waiting to use their venue. I'm going to have to ask you to please clear the archway so the wedding itinerary can proceed. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The executives blinked, taken aback by the polite but incredibly firm and unyielding dismissal. My parents gasped in unison, my mother's hand flying to her pearl necklace as if I had just uttered a string of horrible profanities in a church. Jamal's jaw actually dropped, his arrogant facade slipping into genuine, unmasked disbelief. But Caroline reacted with the speed and ferocity of a cornered viper. She lunged forward, her high heels snapping aggressively against the polished floor. Before I could take a breath, she violently grabbed my upper arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin through the fabric of my dress. She yanked me backward with surprising physical force, pulling me out of the executive's immediate personal space. Her face was flushed a dark mottled red with absolute fury, the veins in her neck protruding as she dragged me a few feet away from the archway. "Are you completely insane?" Caroline hissed, her voice a toxic, venomous whisper, intended only for my ears, though the raw panic in her tone carried easily over the silent dance floor. "Don't you dare speak to them." I did not pull away. I simply looked down at her hand, gripping my arm like a vice, then back up to her flushed, furious face, maintaining an expression of absolute terrifying calm. "The man in the middle is Mr. Harrington, my CEO!" Caroline spat, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic rage. She was practically hyperventilating, entirely convinced I had just destroyed her entire career trajectory with a single polite request. "If your jobless, pathetic mouth offends him, I will make your life a living hell. You will have nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." She shook my arm for emphasis, her breathing ragged, fully expecting me to cower, to apologize, to scurry back to the shadows where she firmly believed I belonged. She expected the unemployed, helpless widow to shrink under the weight of her immense corporate intimidation. She wanted me to beg for forgiveness for jeopardizing her standing with the men who controlled her paycheck. I did not break eye contact with her. I did not tremble, and I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my head, looking past my frantic, hyperventilating sister, and locked eyes directly with Mr. Harrington. Beside him, Arthur stood perfectly still, a microscopic, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I met the gaze of the CEO my sister worshipped like a literal deity, and I simply smirked. Mr. Harrington did not break eye contact with me. A silent, unspoken communication passed between us, a momentary acknowledgement of the absolute absurdity of the woman currently clutching my arm. He offered a slow, deliberate nod of his head, a gesture of profound respect that went entirely unnoticed by my sister. Without saying a single word to Caroline, he smoothly stepped aside, gesturing for Arthur and the rest of his elite entourage to follow. They parted like the Red Sea, clearing the floral archway and moving toward their designated VIP tables with practiced grace. Caroline dropped my arm as if she had been burned, her chest heaving as she stared after her retreating boss. She was visibly bewildered, her mind struggling to process why the most powerful man she knew had just yielded a prime piece of real estate to a woman she deemed entirely worthless. She opened her mouth to call after him, perhaps to offer another fawning apology, but Jamal quickly grabbed her hand and steered her back toward the dance floor, eager to capitalize on the executive's presence at their table. The immediate threat neutralized, I turned my attention back to Mia and her groom. I gave the photographer a swift, commanding wave, and within seconds the flashes were going off. We captured the beautiful, radiant smiles of my daughter and her new husband, the horrific interruption momentarily forgotten in the warmth of the camera lights. As the reception moved forward, the staff discreetly cleared the dinner plates, and the ambient lighting in the ballroom dimmed to a soft, romantic glow. The clinking of crystal glasses began to ripple across the room, signaling the transition to the evening's formal speeches. I reached into my handbag, my fingers brushing against the worn velvet box containing David's family pendant. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I took a deep breath, preparing to stand and deliver the traditional mother of the bride toast to honor the memory of my late husband and to officially present Mia with the heirloom he had saved for this exact occasion. I pushed my chair back, smoothing the front of my dress, But before I could even rise to my feet, a harsh screeching burst of feedback ripped through the ballroom speakers. Guests winced, covering their ears as the horrible sound echoed off the high ceilings. I looked toward the staging area and saw Jamal standing aggressively inside the DJ booth. He had physically shouldered the young, bewildered DJ out of the way, practically ripping the wireless microphone from the man's hands. Jamal tapped the head of the mic heavily, the dull thuds echoing through the room, ensuring he had captured the absolute attention of every single person present. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jamal boomed, his voice dripping with an artificial practiced charisma that made my stomach turn. "If I could have your attention, please. We are going to deviate slightly from the printed programs on your tables tonight. While tradition dictates certain formalities, we all know that true success and true family leadership are not defined by outdated titles. Therefore, to deliver the evening's primary toast, please welcome the woman who has been the actual foundation, the financial savior, and the guiding light of this family. The Senior Vice President of Apex Financial, my beautiful wife Caroline." A collective gasp of shock rippled through the family tables. The groom's parents stared at me with wide, horrified eyes. To completely hijack the mother of the bride's speech was a social transgression so massive it defied basic human decency. But Caroline did not care. She rose from her VIP table to the sound of polite, confused applause from her corporate guests, smoothing her designer gown and striding toward the center of the dance floor with the confident swagger of a conquering general. Jamal handed her the microphone, kissing her cheek before stepping back to admire his handiwork. Caroline took a moment to adjust her stance, deliberately turning her body so she was facing her CEO, Mr. Harrington, rather than the bride and groom. "Thank you, Jamal." Caroline began, her voice echoing loudly. She raised her glass of the vintage Bordeaux she had extorted from the venue. "We are all gathered here tonight to celebrate Mia. But weddings are also a time for reflection. They are a time to look at where we come from, and more importantly, where we are going. And let us be completely honest, this family has faced its fair share of dead weight." A stunned, breathless silence fell over the ballroom. People stopped mid-sip their glasses, hovering in the air as the sheer cruelty of her opening remarks registered. Caroline turned her gaze toward me, a vicious, predatory gleam in her eyes. She pointed her manicured finger directly at my table, ensuring every single guest followed her line of sight. For the past 5 years, she continued, her voice echoing with venomous clarity. "I have carried the burden of this family. When tragedy struck, some people chose to wallow. Some people chose to become an unemployed burden who has lived off our family's charity for 5 years. They sat back and expected the successful, driven members of this family to foot the bill for their entire existence, right down to the lavish party we are standing in today." My mother covered her face with her hands, not in shame for Caroline's actions, but out of embarrassment that the family's supposed financial secrets were being aired in public. Mia was gripping her groom's hand so tightly her knuckles were stark white, her eyes welling with fresh tears as her aunt publicly eviscerated her mother on a microphone. "But that is the beauty of the American dream." Caroline pivoted, her voice rising to a triumphant crescendo as she turned back to her CEO. "It is about rising above the pathetic excuses of those who refuse to work. It is about ruthless ambition. Mia, as you start your new life today, I urge you to look away from the failures of your past. Look up to Jamal and me. Look at what true, unadulterated American success looks like. We are the standard you need to strive for, because relying on the charity of your betters will only lead you exactly where your mother is right now. Absolutely nowhere." She raised her glass high into the air, a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face. To Mia, Caroline toasted loudly. "May you learn to be nothing like the woman who raised you." The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the collective horror of 200 guests. No one raised their glass. No one clapped. I remained perfectly still in my chair, the velvet box warm in my hand, my expression an unreadable mask. Let her dig the grave. I would bury her in it soon enough. The groom's parents seated beside me looked physically ill. His mother, a woman of impeccable grace, leaned toward me, her voice trembling with quiet outrage, offering to signal the venue security to have Caroline forcibly removed from the premises. I gently touched her hand and declined thanking her for her fierce loyalty. They saw Caroline for exactly who she was. Even the executives at the VIP table shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Men accustomed to ruthless corporate warfare easily recognized the profound tastelessness of attacking a grieving mother at her own daughter's wedding. I watched my beautiful bride, the girl I had raised and loved with every fiber of my being. The shock on Mia's face mutated into a blazing, uncontainable fury. She did not look to her new husband for permission. She did not look at me for guidance. Mia stood up, pushing her chair back with a loud screech against the polished floor, and gathered the heavy layers of her white gown. She marched across the ballroom floor, moving with a singular, terrifying purpose that mirrored the exact anger boiling inside my own chest. Caroline was still smiling, lowering her wineglass, soaking in what she delusionally believed was awed silence. She did not see Mia coming until the bride was standing directly in front of her. With a swift, fluid motion, Mia reached out and ripped the microphone straight out of her aunt's manicured hand. Caroline stumbled back in shock, her mouth opening in a silent gasp of outrage at the sudden aggression. "How dare you!" Mia's voice echoed through the speakers, shaking with a mix of hot tears and absolute rage. "How dare you stand at my wedding and speak about my mother that way?" Mia turned to the crowd, the tears she had fought all day finally spilling over her cheeks, but she proudly refused to wipe them away. "That woman sitting right there," Mia pointed directly at me, her voice ringing out with fierce conviction, "is the only reason I am standing here today. When my father died, she stepped up. She sacrificed her sleep, her own comfort, and her peace of mind to make sure I never went without. She is not just my stepmother. She is my hero. You are nothing but a bitter, jealous bully who has to tear down a grieving widow just to feel important." The ballroom was completely electrified. Caroline stood frozen, publicly humiliated by the bride. But before Mia could utter another word, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the side of the room. My parents, terrified of losing face in front of the apex financial executives, practically sprinted onto the dance floor. My father grabbed Mia by the arm, pulling her back with a harsh jerk, while my mother stepped in front of Caroline like a human shield. "Mia, stop this instant," my father hissed, though his furious reprimand was picked up by the microphone she still clutched. "You are embarrassing yourself in this family." My mother glared at her granddaughter, her eyes completely void of any familial warmth. "Apologize to your aunt right now," she demanded, her tone dripping with toxic authority. Caroline paid a fortune for those VIP tables. She brought highly respected, important people to your little party, and you are disrespecting her in front of her CEO. You are acting like a spoiled, ungrateful brat. Hand over the microphone and go back to your seat before you ruin your aunt's career." Mia yanked her arm out of her grandfather's grip, stepping back as if she had been burned by the sheer betrayal. The groom was already out of his seat, rushing forward to shield his wife, but I beat him to it. I rose from my chair. The time for silent endurance was officially over. The room watched in a suffocating hush as I walked toward the center of the dance floor. Every eye tracked my movement. I saw the pity on the faces of the guests. I saw Jamal smirking from his table, nudging a colleague, undoubtedly expecting a tearful, pathetic breakdown. They all braced themselves for the devastated stepmother to run out crying or to beg her parents for peace. I stepped past my parents, entirely ignoring their presence, as if they were nothing but ghosts. I walked right up to Mia, offering her a soft, reassuring smile, and gently slipped the microphone from her trembling fingers. I signaled the groom to take her back to the sweetheart table. Once they were safely away from the toxicity of my family, I turned to face the crowd. I did not cry. My voice did not shake. I stood with my spine perfectly straight, channeling every ounce of absolute authority I possessed. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, letting Caroline sweat under the heavy gaze of the entire room. Then I turned my back on my sister and my parents, pivoting my body to stare dead center at the VIP table where Mr. Harrington and Arthur were seated. My sister has spent the better part of the last 48 hours treating my daughter's wedding like a corporate acquisition. I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity, perfectly calm and utterly commanding. She has loudly and repeatedly informed this room that I am an unemployed burden, a pathetic charity case living off the scraps of her success. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the executives' table, my eyes locking directly onto the CEO of Apex Financial. Arthur leaned forward, a dangerous gleam in his eye, while Mr. Harrington sat perfectly still, instantly recognizing the massive shift in the atmosphere. Unemployed, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air, allowing a slow, razor-sharp smirk to spread across my face. Since Caroline loves networking so much, perhaps she should introduce me to her boss. The blood drained from Caroline's face, leaving her with a chalky skeletal mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Her eyes, usually hard and calculating, flickered wildly between my steady gaze and the man she had spent years trying to impress. The arrogance that had fueled her toast evaporated in an instant, replaced by a desperate animalistic instinct to protect the ladder she was climbing. She did not even look at Jamal. She simply bolted. She moved with the chaotic, ungraceful speed of a woman whose entire future was suddenly dangling over a precipice. Her designer heels skidded on the hardwood as she sprinted toward the VIP table, her arms outstretched like she was trying to intercept a pass in a football game. She threw herself into the gap between me and the CEO, her chest heaving as she planted her feet, forcing me to stop walking or risk physical collision. She stood there shivering with a mixture of adrenaline and spite, her body vibrating with the effort of containment. She leaned in her perfume, a cloying, suffocating cloud, as she hissed at me, the sound so venomous it could have scorched paint. "You are not going to ruin this," she spat, her voice a serrated whisper. "You are a stain on this family, a pathetic, grieving mess, who cannot stand to see anyone else be happy. If you take one more step toward that table, I will make sure you are dragged out of here by the police. Do you really want to humiliate yourself more than you already have? You are the disgrace here, not me." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at her with a mild, detached curiosity, as if she were a particularly irritating insect buzzing in my ear. She looked ridiculous, a woman in an overpriced gown, sweating and shaking, desperate to hide her own sister from her boss. Jamal was already in motion. He saw the shift in the room, saw the way the guests were leaning in their phones, held high to capture the spectacle. He knew exactly how the optics looked, a successful, polished corporate couple being accosted by the erratic, grieving sister. He strode over, his smile tight, and practiced placing a comforting arm around Caroline's shoulders, while simultaneously positioning himself to block the VIP table from my view. He looked at Mr. Harrington and Arthur, his expression one of pained, brotherly amusement. "My deepest apologies, Sir," Jamal announced, his voice projecting a false, oily warmth that filled the room. He spoke with the tone of someone apologizing for a child's tantrum at a dinner party. "We are so incredibly sorry for this outburst. Please do not mind my sister-in-law. She has been going through a very difficult time since the death of her husband, and I am afraid the stress of the wedding has caused her to have a bit of a breakdown. She is not herself. She is quite frankly mentally unstable and currently completely broke. We have been trying to manage her, but as you can see, she is determined to make a scene to garner attention." He turned back to me, his eyes hard and mocking beneath the veneer of sympathy. "Athena, honey, come now. You are making a mess of yourself. You are broke, you are lost, and you are hurting. Let us get you out of here before you embarrass your daughter even further." The room held its breath. The silence was so profound that the hum of the air conditioning unit sounded like a jet engine. I watched Mr. Harrington. He did not look at Jamal. He did not look at Caroline. His gaze was locked on me, his eyebrows slightly raised in a look of cool, detached interest. Arthur beside him was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes flickering between us as if he were watching a high-stakes game of chess. Caroline looked triumphant. She thought she had won. She thought the mentally unstable broke label was the final nail in my coffin, the perfect way to dismiss me as a non-entity. She turned back to me, her grin wide and mocking, waiting for me to crumble, to run away in tears, to fulfill the tragic role she had assigned me. I looked past her, past Jamal's smug protective posture, and looked right into Mr. Harrington's eyes. I did not apologize. I did not shrink. I simply smiled a slow, genuine smile that reached my eyes. If I am truly the unstable, broke failure my brother-in-law suggests, then you have absolutely nothing to fear from a conversation with me, I said, my voice projecting across the room with a calm that seemed to rattle them. But if I am perhaps someone whose professional reputation has been the subject of some very creative storytelling by my sister, then you might find a 10-minute conversation quite enlightening. Caroline's smirk faltered. She felt the shift in the room, the way Mr. Harrington had ignored Jamal's plea, the way he had actually shifted his weight, preparing to listen. Her hands flew up, clutching her own throat, her breathing becoming shallow. She looked like she wanted to scream, but the presence of her CEO kept her jaw locked tight. Jamal's smile became fixed, a rigid grimace that did not touch his eyes. He tightened his grip on Caroline's shoulder, his knuckles turning white. He was realizing in real time that he had played a losing hand. He had tried to frame me as a desperate woman looking for a handout, but I had just framed him as a liar and a manipulator in front of the very person he was trying to impress. Mr. Harrington stood up. The movement was slow and graceful, like a predator rising to investigate an interesting sound. The entire ballroom seemed to shrink as he stood, his height and presence dwarfing the chaotic scene at the dance floor. He adjusted his charcoal suit jacket, ignored Caroline entirely, and took a deliberate step toward me. I find myself intrigued, Mr. Harrington said. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried an authority that silenced the last few whispers in the room. Unstable people rarely make such articulate arguments, and I have always found that the most interesting business often starts with a disruption. Caroline looked as if she were going to faint. She looked at the CEO, then at me, her eyes pleading for a sanity that she had destroyed the moment she took that microphone. Jamal made one last frantic attempt to regain control, stepping in front of Mr. Harrington with an outstretched hand, but Arthur took one single step forward, and Jamal froze, his hand dropping to his side as if he had been slapped. Caroline, Mr. Harrington said without turning around, "Take your seat. We are quite capable of having a conversation." The order was absolute. Caroline wobbled her knees, appearing to give out before Jamal had to physically nudge her back toward their table. She moved like a sleepwalker, her eyes fixed on the floor, her ego shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She collapsed into her chair, her face a pale, ghostly ruin, while the 200 guests watched in rapt, terrified silence. I remained standing, the microphone still in my hand, ready for the next move. The heavy silence that had fallen over the ballroom was suddenly broken by the sharp, grating sound of wooden chairs scraping against the polished hardwood floor. At the sweetheart table, Mia's new husband stood tall, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line, his arm wrapped protectively around his bride. But the real tectonic shift in the room's atmosphere came from the table directly adjacent to the dance floor. The groom's parents had seen enough. They were a family of substantial, quiet wealth. They did not flaunt their status with aggressive networking, flashy synthetic floral arrangements, or loud, boastful toasts meant to demean others. They operated with a quiet, unshakable dignity that Caroline and Jamal could never hope to understand, let alone replicate. The groom's father, a man whose reputation commanded instant respect across the city's highest social circles, rose to his feet. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. Beside him, his wife stood up in tandem, her posture rigid with absolute aristocratic outrage. They moved as a united front, disgusted by the sheer, unadulterated classlessness playing out before them. "I will not sit here and allow this atrocious behavior to continue for another second," the groom's father declared, his voice projecting across the ballroom, without the need for a microphone. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at Jamal and Caroline with absolute, unvarnished disgust. "You have hijacked a sacred moment to inflate your own fragile egos. You have insulted the mother of the bride, a woman who has shown more grace, more strength, and more pure class today than the two of you could ever hope to muster in a lifetime." The mother of the groom took a step forward, her eyes locking onto Caroline, who was currently trembling in her seat. "Do not dare project your own desperate insecurities onto Haley," she stated, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. We know exactly who financed this beautiful wedding. We know exactly who sacrificed everything to ensure Mia had the perfect day. And we know exactly who attempted to sabotage the floral arrangements this morning out of sheer petty spite. You are not powerful, you are just loud. A collective murmur of agreement rippled through the 200 guests. The polished veneer of my family's carefully curated image was cracking, shattering into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the very people they were desperate to impress. The groom's family, the wealthy, connected individuals Jamal had been dying to network with all evening, were publicly aligning themselves with the supposedly unemployed broken widow. Jamal practically tripped over his own feet, his corporate instincts short-circuiting as panic flooded his system. He was a man used to managing narratives, a man who believed he could spin any disaster into a minor, easily dismissible inconvenience. He pivoted away from the dance floor, his face flushed a dark mottled red, and rushed toward the groom's parents with his hands raised in a placating defensive gesture. "Please, please, I beg of you to understand," Jamal stammered, his usually smooth voice cracking under the intense pressure. He was sweating profusely, the confident swagger he had displayed just moments ago entirely eradicated. "This is simply a deeply personal family matter that has unfortunately spilled over into the reception. We meant absolutely no disrespect to you or your wonderful family. Caroline is just fiercely protective of our family's reputation, and dealing with grief can make people unpredictable. We are simply trying to manage an incredibly volatile situation." He was still trying to push the narrative that I was the volatile one. He was still trying to save face. The groom's father stared at Jamal with an expression of such profound pity and contempt that it would have destroyed a lesser man. He did not even dignify Jamal's pathetic groveling excuse with a response. He simply turned his back on him, offering his arm to his wife, shielding her from Jamal's frantic, desperate energy. Realizing that he had completely lost the respect of the groom's family, Jamal spun back around. His chest was heaving, his tie slightly askew. He needed an ally. He desperately needed validation from someone higher up the food chain to prove that he and Caroline were not the villains of the evening. His eyes darted wildly before landing on the VIP table. He needed Mr. Harrington. He needed the CEO of Apex Financial to look at him with understanding, to nod in agreement that corporate professionals sometimes had to deal with messy, emotional relatives. Jamal practically sprinted the short distance to the VIP table. He bent down slightly, invading Mr. Harrington's personal space in a way that screamed of utter desperation. He clasped his hands together, his face a mask of pleading agony. "Sir, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am that you have been subjected to this utterly unprofessional environment." Jamal babbled, his words stumbling over each other in his rush to apologize. "Caroline and I were only trying to ensure the evening proceeded smoothly. I know how much you value decorum, and I promise you we are handling this. We can have venue security escort her out immediately. We can salvage this evening. Please do not let the actions of a mentally unstable broke woman reflect poorly on Caroline's dedication to Apex Financial. She is a star performer, sir. You know this. This is just an unfortunate disruption." Jamal stood there breathless, waiting for the lifeline. He waited for the CEO to agree to dismiss me as a nuisance to validate Carolyn's toxic, venomous behavior. The ballroom fell into a silence so thick and heavy it felt like it could suffocate every person in the room. The music was completely dead. The guests were holding their collective breath, their eyes darting between the sweating, desperate figure of Jamal and the cold, unreadable face of the silver-haired CEO. Arthur, seated quietly beside his boss, simply crossed his arms and watched the spectacular self-destruction of Jamal's pride with a cold, analytical gaze. Mr. Harrington did not say a word. He did not offer a comforting smile. He did not acknowledge Jamal's frantic, groveling apologies, nor did he spare a single glance for Caroline, who was currently weeping silently into a napkin at her table, her career flashing before her eyes. Very slowly, with the agonizing, deliberate pacing of a man who held all the power in the universe, Mr. Harrington placed his linen napkin on the table. He leaned forward and smoothly pushed his chair back. He stood up to his full, imposing height, smoothing the front of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. Jamal took a hesitant step back, a nervous, hopeful smile twitching on his lips, expecting his boss to finally address him and restore order to his shattered reality. Instead, Mr. Harrington walked straight past him. He moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, brushing past Jamal as if my brother-in-law were nothing more than an invisible wisp of smoke. He did not look left or right. He did not address the groom's parents or the whispering crowd. He walked directly onto the center of the dance floor, his piercing gaze locked entirely unwaveringly on me. The distance between us closed with agonizing, exquisite slowness. 10 feet? 8 feet. Mr. Harrington's expression was completely devoid of the typical corporate condescension my sister so fiercely worshipped. Instead, it held a profound, recognizing clarity. He knew exactly who I was. Arthur followed closely behind, a silent sentinel, his sniper-like focus confirming that this entire sequence had been calculated down to the precise second. Behind him, the illusion of Caroline's composure violently shattered. The realization that her ultimate superior was not marching over to demand my removal, but was instead approaching me with a bizarre, inexplicable focus, completely broke her reality. With a strangled, unhinged sound that echoed terribly across the quiet ballroom, she scrambled out of her chair. Her designer gown caught momentarily on the table leg, nearly sending her sprawling, but she recovered with the desperate, frantic energy of a cornered animal. She sprinted across the polished floor. I watched her close the distance, her face contorted into a mask of pure, sweating panic. She physically threw herself into the shrinking space between Mr. Harrington and myself, breathing heavily, acting as a frantic human barricade. She reached out her trembling, manicured hands, hovering just inches from the fabric of his tailored jacket, terrified to actually touch him, but desperate to halt his progression. "Mr. Harrington, I am so sorry," Caroline whispered. Her voice was meant to be discreet, but the sheer trembling terror behind it forced the words out in a harsh, ragged hiss that carried easily in the dead silent room. "Please, sir, you have to ignore her. She is just an unemployed loser. She has no idea what she is doing." Caroline's chest heaved as she pointed a shaking finger at my face. She was practically vibrating with venom, doubling down on her delusion because it was the only reality she knew how to navigate. "She is nobody. A pathetic, grieving widow who has lived off my charity for years. Please let security handle this trash. Do not let her ruin this event for you. I beg you, sir, do not even look at her." The raw toxicity of her words hung in the air, a desperate plea to the corporate hierarchy she believed would protect her. She expected Mr. Harrington to nod in agreement, to look at me with the same aristocratic disgust she had harbored for 5 long years. She waited for the validation that would restore her fractured universe. It never came. Mr. Harrington stopped dead in his tracks. The physical shift in his demeanor was immediate and absolute. He did not recoil from Caroline, nor did he shout. He simply turned his head a fraction of an inch and looked down at her. It was not a look of anger. It was a look of chilling, abysmal emptiness. It was the gaze of a man observing a speck of dirt on his expensive shoe. Arthur, anticipating the command before it was even spoken, stepped forward and smoothly placed a firm, immovable hand on Caroline's upper arm. He effortlessly pulled her aside, clearing the path with the practiced efficiency of a man removing an irritating, inconsequential obstacle. Caroline gasped, stumbling awkwardly in her high heels, her mouth opening and closing in soundless shock as she was physically relocated out of her boss's trajectory. With the frantic obstruction removed, Mr. Harrington turned his attention back to me. The glacial corporate mask he wore for my sister melted away in an instant. He took the final 2 steps, stopping just a breath away. The entire ballroom was so quiet that the faint rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer could be heard echoing through the floral archways. A deeply respectful smile spread across Mr. Harrington's face, reaching his eyes and transforming his imposing features into an expression of profound deferential admiration. It was a look of pure reverence, completely stripping away the power dynamic my sister and brother-in-law had so desperately tried to fabricate all evening. Slowly, deliberately, the CEO of Apex Financial bowed his head slightly. It was not a casual nod. It was a formal, unequivocal submission of respect, executed in front of 200 staring guests, in front of the groom's wealthy family, And most importantly, in front of the sister who just spent 20 minutes attempting to destroy my dignity on a microphone. "It is an absolute honor to finally meet you in person," Madam Chairman Mr. Harrington said. His voice was incredibly calm, yet the volume was perfectly modulated to carry across the breathless silence of the dance floor. The words did not just fall into the room, they detonated. The title hung in the air, shifting the gravitational pull of the entire venue. Madam Chairman. Behind him, the air violently left Caroline's lungs in a sharp, wheezing gasp. Her eyes widened to impossible proportions, the whites stark against her flushed skin. She stared at Mr. Harrington's bowed head, then slowly, agonizingly dragged her gaze up to meet my calm, unwavering expression. The cognitive dissonance fractured whatever was left of her sanity. Her jaw practically unhinged as she tried to process the impossible reality that her ultimate boss, the man who controlled her entire professional existence, just bowed to the unemployed widow she had relentlessly tormented. Jamal, still hovering near the VIP tables, went completely rigid. The wine glass he was clutching slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor with a sharp crystalline crash that echoed like a gunshot. The dark red liquid bled across the polished oak, but no one, not even the waitstaff, moved to clean it up. Jamal's arrogant, manufactured swagger evaporated entirely, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man who just realized he had spent 5 years ruthlessly mocking the entity that held the deed to his livelihood. A synchronized wave of shock washed over the guest tables. My parents stared at me, their mouths agape, their minds short-circuiting as they tried to reconcile the subservient daughter they had constantly belittled with the billionaire corporate titan standing before them. The groom's parents exchanged a look of pure, vindicated triumph. Mia let out a watery, overwhelmed laugh, her hands flying to cover her mouth as the true extent of my sacrifices finally revealed itself in spectacular fashion. I did not look at my parents' shattered faces, nor did I spare a glance for Caroline's hyperventilating form. I kept my focus entirely on the man standing before me. I offered Mr. Harrington a gracious, welcoming smile, accepting the immense reverence he offered with the quiet, unshakable authority I had guarded in secret for half a decade. The title hung in the air, a profound declaration that completely altered the fundamental reality of every single person in the room. I offered Mr. Harrington a gracious, welcoming smile, accepting his immense reverence with the quiet, unshakable authority I had guarded in secret for half a decade. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you face to face, Richard," I replied, my voice steady and warm. "I only wish the circumstances of our introduction tonight had been slightly more professional." Mr. Harrington straightened his posture, his eyes briefly sweeping over the extravagant floral arrangements and the stunned faces of the wedding guests before settling back on me. "The lack of professionalism in this room does not originate from you, Madam Chairman. That much is abundantly clear." He then turned his body with the slow, deliberate precision of a bank vault door closing. The warmth in his eyes vanished entirely, replaced by a glacial, punishing freeze as he directed his attention to Caroline. She was still frozen in her chair, her mouth hanging open, her chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked gasps. The vibrant, arrogant woman who had practically danced across the floor to humiliate me was gone, replaced by a terrified employee staring down the barrel of her own professional execution. Mr. Harrington stared at her, letting the sheer weight of his authority press down on her shoulders. The room went entirely silent. The whispers that had been buzzing through the crowd abruptly ceased. Even the waitstaff stood perfectly still, trays balanced precariously in their hands, sensing that history was being made on the polished hardwood of the dance floor. "An unemployed loser." Mr. Harrington's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute obedience. He repeated her exact words, tasting the sheer audacity of them before spitting them back out. "Is that truly how you describe the architect of your entire career? Are you referring to the founder of Apex Holdings?" Caroline let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. She tried to shake her head, tried to formulate a sentence, but her vocal cords refused to cooperate. Her eyes darted frantically toward our parents, begging for a rescue that was never going to come. My mother and father were paralyzed, their faces drained of all color, staring at me as if I had suddenly morphed into a mythical creature. They had spent my entire life measuring my worth against Caroline's loud, flashy achievements. They had believed every lie she spun because I had chosen to live quietly, investing my late husband's life insurance, building a vast corporate portfolio from my home office, and silently acquiring massive assets while raising my daughter. They mistook my modesty for failure, and now that massive miscalculation was unfolding before them in spectacular, devastating fashion. Mr. Harrington took a single step toward Caroline's table. "Are you referring to the woman who just bought out our entire corporate group this morning?" he demanded, his voice ringing with crystal clarity. "The woman who reviewed your quarterly performance metrics yesterday and generously decided to allow you to keep your position despite your team's lackluster results. That unemployed loser." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Caroline physically shrank in her seat. The truth was a tidal wave she could not outrun. For years, she had built her identity around her corporate title, using it as a weapon to belittle me, to control our parents, and to demand VIP treatment at my daughter's wedding. She had flaunted her proximity to Apex Financial's executives, completely unaware that the very entity signing her paychecks, the massive holding company that had aggressively acquired her firm at 8 o'clock this morning, was solely owned and operated by the sister she openly despised. Jamal, who had been standing nearby in a state of catatonic shock, suddenly snapped out of his stupor. The sheer terror of losing his lavish lifestyle overrode his common sense. He desperately grabbed a fresh glass of red wine from the table, his hand shaking violently as he sought some kind of physical anchor. He took a stumbling step forward, his face slick with nervous perspiration. "Mr. Harrington, sir, please." Jamal begged, his voice high and reedy, devoid of any of his usual slick corporate charm. "There has been a colossal misunderstanding. Caroline did not know. We had no idea about the acquisition. We thought Haley was struggling. We were just trying to push her to do better. It was tough love. Family dynamics are complicated, sir. Surely you understand. We have the utmost respect for Apex Holdings and its leadership." Mr. Harrington did not even blink. He looked at Jamal with the kind of absolute disgust usually reserved for toxic waste. He did not entertain the pathetic excuse. He did not engage in a debate about family dynamics or tough love. He simply observed the sweating, groveling man before him with cold, clinical detachment. "Ignorance is not an excuse for cruelty." Mr. Harrington stated, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "And I have zero tolerance for executives who lack basic human decency, situational awareness, and the intelligence to know exactly who they are speaking to. You do not represent the values of Apex Financial, and you certainly do not represent the standard expected by Apex Holdings." Mr. Harrington shifted his gaze, taking in both Caroline's weeping, ruined face and Jamal's panicked, trembling posture. He delivered the final, undeniable verdict with the effortless precision of a guillotine dropping. "Caroline, Jamal, you are both fired, effective immediately." The sound of Jamal dropping his wineglass shatters the dead silence. The sharp sound of shattering crystal echoed through the massive ballroom, sending a spray of red wine across the pristine white tablecloths and the polished shoes of the Apex executives. Jamal stared down at the mess, his hands trembling violently at his sides, completely paralyzed by the sudden execution of his entire career. But Caroline could not accept reality. Her mind, perfectly conditioned to believe her own fabricated superiority, actively rejected the scene unfolding before her. She let out a high, hysterical laugh that sounded like scraping metal. She shook her head, her manicured fingers clawing at the empty air between us. "This is a joke," Caroline stammered, her voice shrill and desperate, cracking under the intense strain. "This is a sick, twisted prank. Mr. Harrington, sir, please. You are a brilliant man. You cannot possibly believe this charade. Look at her." She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, her eyes wild with a manic refusal to understand. "She does not own Apex Holdings. She does not own anything. She sits at home in sweatpants and bakes casseroles. She has literally spent the last 5 years wiping down kitchen counters and volunteering at bake sales. She is a nobody. She is my pathetic sister who could not even afford a proper caterer for this wedding if she had to pay for it herself. You are being scammed. This is a lie. Mr. Harrington did not flinch at her outburst. He did not show an ounce of pity for the woman completely unraveling in front of him. His expression turned to absolute ice. Slowly, he reached into the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal jacket. The ballroom watched in collective fascination as he withdrew a thick, premium parchment document folded neatly in thirds. He held it up for a fraction of a second, letting the heavy silence amplify the weight of his actions. With a swift, aggressive motion, he slammed the document onto the nearest linen-covered table. The thud resonated like a gavel drop. "An unemployed loser," Mr. Harrington asked, his voice dripping with lethal corporate authority. "Are you referring to the founder of Apex Holdings? The woman who just bought out our entire corporate group this morning?" He tapped his index finger sharply against the bottom right corner of the final page, leaning in, so Caroline could clearly see the ink. "Her signature is right here. Get out of my sight before I call security." Caroline stared at the contract. Her eyes traced the bold, unmistakable loops of my handwriting perfectly inscribed next to the printed title of Chairman and Chief Executive Officer. The oxygen seemed to vanish from her lungs. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the hem of her expensive gown, nearly sending her crashing into the shattered glass at Jamal's feet. Jamal caught her by the arm, not out of affection, but out of a shared, blinding terror. They looked like two strangers waking up in a nightmare they had explicitly designed for someone else. My parents were equally petrified. They stood near their table, their faces drained of all color, looking at me as if I were a ghost that had just materialized from the floorboards. For decades, they had relentlessly championed Caroline's loud, abrasive version of success, measuring a person's worth entirely by their willingness to boast and claw their way to the top. They had fundamentally believed my quiet existence was a symptom of failure. Now they were trapped in the inescapable glare of their own colossal misjudgment. The time for silence was over. The time for letting them construct my narrative had officially expired. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving away from Mr. Harrington and Arthur, to stand entirely on my own merit in the center of the dance floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or gloat. I spoke with the calm, devastating precision of a woman who had spent 5 years mastering the art of the perfect strike. "You always needed everyone to believe I was broken, Caroline," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the sound system I still controlled. "You needed me to be a failure so you could feel successful. You needed me to be poor so you could feel rich. But while you were spending every waking moment trying to convince the world of your importance, I was actually building mine." I turned to face my parents, watching the guilt and shock battle across their aging faces. When my husband died, I continued holding their gaze until they were forced to look away in shame. He left behind a substantial life insurance policy. Every single one of you assumed I lived off that money. You assumed I drained it to pay the mortgage and keep the lights on while crying into my coffee. I let a small, genuine smile cross my lips as I looked over at Mia, my beautiful daughter, who was standing beside her new husband with tears of pride streaming down her cheeks. I never touched a single cent of that money for myself. I took the entire sum, every last dollar, and placed it into a locked, irrevocable trust for Mia. It was her father's final gift to her, and I made sure her future was utterly and completely secured. Caroline let out a soft, choking gasp, shaking her head, as if trying to physically dislodge my words from her ears. "I stayed home," I said, projecting my voice so every executive, every family member, and every guest could hear the undeniable truth. "I stayed home for 5 years because my teenage daughter had just lost the center of her universe. She did not need a mother who was traveling the globe, proving her worth to a boardroom. She needed a mother who was present. She needed someone to make breakfast, to be there when she got home from school, to hold her when the grief became too heavy to carry. So I baked the casseroles. I wiped down the counters. I volunteered at the school. I made sure her life remained stable and anchored in unwavering love. I took one final step toward my sister, letting the full weight of my actual reality crush her remaining delusions. And while she was sleeping while she was at soccer practice, while the rest of you were dismissing me as a useless housewife, I opened my laptop. I started trading. I started investing. I took a modest personal savings account and systematically built a venture capital empire from my kitchen table. I did not need a corner office to acquire power, Caroline. I did not need to scream about my success at family dinners. I built Apex Holdings in silence, and I bought out your entire corporate group while drinking my morning coffee. The revelation hung over the dance floor like a physical weight, suffocating the last remnants of Caroline's fabricated reality. She had completely retreated into a catatonic state of shock, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound, her eyes locked on the acquisition contract resting on the table. Jamal, however, was a creature of pure, unadulterated ego. His entire identity was inextricably wrapped up in his perceived status, his expensive tailored suits, and the unlimited corporate card sitting heavy in his breast pocket. To be stripped of his title in front of the city's corporate elite, and worst of all, in front of the groom's aristocratic family, was a fate worse than death. He needed a lifeline, a desperate mechanism to prove that even if his employment was terminated, he was still a man of substantial wealth and undeniable consequence. Sweat beaded heavily on his forehead, rolling down his temples as he straightened his tie with violently shaking hands. He looked toward the VIP table, then at the half-empty bottles of vintage Bordeaux he had so loudly boasted about purchasing earlier in the evening. The $15,000 wine. That was his ticket back to dignity. He needed to show this room that losing a job was a mere inconvenience for a man of his stature. Jamal snapped his fingers, a harsh, frantic sound waving down the venue manager who had been watching the spectacular drama unfold from the perimeter of the ballroom. The manager, a sharply dressed man named Vincent, stepped forward cautiously, his eyes darting between the shattered glass on the floor and the furious executives. Jamal puffed out his chest, projecting a booming voice that cracked noticeably at the edges. "Vincent, bring me the bill for the VIP table's wine," immediately Jamal commanded, attempting to summon his usual arrogant cadence. "All of it. I stated I was hosting those bottles, and I am a man of my word. I will not have my generosity or my financial standing overshadowed by this ridiculous petty corporate restructuring." He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a sleek, heavy black metal corporate card, slapping it down onto the nearest linen-covered table with a defiant thud. "Run it. Include a 20% gratuity. I want everyone in this room to know that my wealth is not dictated by the whims of a holding company or a bitter sister-in-law." He shot me a venomous, triumphant glare, desperately hoping this final display of financial superiority would somehow overwrite the humiliation of his public execution. He wanted the narrative to be that he was walking away independently, too rich to care about the loss of a mere title. I did not flinch. I did not interrupt him. I simply watched his pathetic display with a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the cold, clinical smile of a predator watching its prey willingly step into a steel snare. The venue manager picked up the heavy metal card, looking hesitantly between Jamal, Mr. Harrington, and myself. Arthur gave the manager a microscopic nod, a silent authorization to proceed with the transaction. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Jamal, folding my hands neatly in front of me, letting the anticipation build in the dead silent room. "Swipe it, Jamal," I said, my voice ringing out with a chilling musical clarity that cut effortlessly through his manufactured bravado. "Let us all witness the full extent of your incredible generosity. Let us see if it works." Jamal sneered, his chest puffing out further as Vincent pulled a sleek mobile payment terminal from his jacket pocket. "You truly think you have won because of some technical corporate buyout?" Jamal spat, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged hiss, meant only for me. "I am still a wealthy man. You cannot erase my assets just because you bought a piece of paper." "I am not trying to erase your assets," I replied, tilting my head slightly, my eyes locked dead on his sweating face. "I am simply revoking what legally belongs to me." Jamal frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through his arrogance, just as Vincent slid the heavy black metal card through the terminal. The machine processed for 3 agonizing stretching seconds. The entire ballroom seemed to lean in, waiting for the verdict. Then a sharp, angry electronic beep pierced the silence. The screen flashed a bright, undeniable red error message. Vincent cleared his throat, looking deeply uncomfortable as he held the terminal out. "Sir, the card has been declined." Jamal's face contorted in furious disbelief. The color completely drained from his cheeks. "That is impossible," he stammered, his voice climbing an octave. "Run it again. The machine is faulty. There is no limit on that account. I am a senior vice president." He grabbed the card from Vincent's hand and tried to shove it back into the terminal himself, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it onto the floor. I took another step forward, closing the distance between us, bringing my face inches from his. "The machine works perfectly, Jamal," I said, my tone laced with glacial amusement. "The issue is not the technology. The issue is that your corporate account was terminated." When Apex Holdings acquired the group at 8 o'clock this morning, a full, comprehensive audit of executive spending was immediately initiated. And exactly 10 minutes ago, right around the time Caroline violently grabbed that microphone to declare me an unemployed loser, my firm froze all auxiliary corporate accounts for executives pending termination. Jamal stared at the piece of black metal in his hand, as if it had suddenly turned into radioactive waste. The reality of his absolute unmitigated ruin finally breached his thick skull. He had nothing, no job, no corporate backing, and now not even the illusion of wealth to hide behind. The $15,000 bill for the wine he had so arrogantly bragged about was now a personal debt he could not pay. He looked at the venue manager, then at the groom's parents, who were watching his ultimate humiliation with undisguised contempt. Caroline let out a ragged, terrifying sob, finally realizing the inescapable trap they had willingly walked into. They had aggressively dug their own graves, and I had simply handed them the shovels. But the most nauseating, spectacular shift in the room was yet to come. My parents had been standing frozen near their table in a state of pale, terrified silence. For 30 years they had worshipped exclusively at the altar of wealth and status. They had consistently enabled Caroline's cruelty because they believed her proximity to corporate power elevated their own social standing. They had treated me as a burden, a failure, a permanent stain on their pristine social record. But the very second that payment terminal beeped, confirming Jamal's utter financial destruction and my absolute billionaire supremacy, a horrifying metamorphosis occurred. My father, a man who had not offered me a genuine compliment or a warm glance in a decade, suddenly snapped his posture perfectly straight. The look of profound shame on his face vanished instantly, replaced by a sickeningly bright, fawning smile. He stepped right over the shattered glass of Jamal's dropped wine, physically turning his back on Caroline as she wept uncontrollably into her hands. He pushed past his formerly favored daughter as if she were a piece of discarded, rotting trash. My mother was right on his heels, her eyes wide and glittering with a newfound ravenous adoration. She literally stepped on Caroline's expensive designer train, ignoring her youngest daughter's breakdown entirely. Her hands were outstretched toward me in a grotesque, highly calculated display of manufactured maternal affection. They had realized they were backing the wrong horse, and their pivot was instantaneous, seamless, and entirely driven by greed. "Haley, sweetheart." My mother's voice was a cloying, syrupy pitch that I had only ever heard her use when speaking to wealthy socialites or country club presidents. She shoved her way past Arthur, who stepped aside only after I gave him a subtle, dismissive nod. She reached out her heavily ringed fingers, grasping for my hands, her face stretched into a mask of pure, frantic devotion. My father flanked her, adjusting his posture to mirror the alpha male stance he used to intimidate his subordinates. "A billionaire," he boomed, letting the word roll off his tongue, as if he had minted the currency himself. His eyes darted momentarily to Mr. Harrington, desperately seeking validation from the corporate titan before turning back to me. "We always knew you were the smart one, Haley. We always said it, did we not, Elaine? We always knew that quiet focus of yours was hiding something brilliant. You have the Wilson drive. I can see exactly how you pulled this off. You let everyone underestimate you while you secured the real power. It is a masterpiece of corporate strategy. I am so incredibly proud to be your father." My mother nodded enthusiastically, her diamond earrings catching the light as she practically vibrated with greed. "Oh, absolutely, darling. We knew you were just biding your time. To think all those years we worried about you, you were actually building an empire. You are the absolute star of this family. You always have been." She squeezed my hands, leaning in close, attempting to create a sphere of maternal intimacy that had never actually existed between us. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial, wheedling whisper. "But Haley, my brilliant girl, we do have a tiny family situation to manage now. Your sister is completely devastated. You have proven your point spectacularly, and we are all in awe of you. But Caroline has that massive mortgage on the new estate in the Hamptons. Jamal's lifestyle is incredibly expensive, and they just booked that luxury trip to the Maldives. You cannot possibly let Mr. Harrington fire them. You have the ultimate authority now. You own the company. I need you to override his decision. Give Caroline her job back. Put Jamal on the board. Keep the family together, sweetheart. It is what family does." I looked down at my mother's hands gripping mine. The physical touch made my skin crawl. For 30 years, I had craved this exact validation. I had spent my childhood hoping they would look at me with the same pride they reserved for Caroline. I had wanted their approval more than anything else in the world. But receiving it now, bought and paid for with $1 billion corporate acquisition, tasted like pure ash. It was entirely transactional. I slowly pulled my hands out of her grasp. The movement was gentle, but the rejection was absolute. I took a half step back, putting a definitive physical distance between myself and the two people who had created me. "Do not rewrite history to suit your current financial desperation," I said, my voice echoing with a calm, resonant authority that silenced her frantic pleading instantly. "You did not always know I was the smart one. You spent my entire life telling me I was a disappointment. You stood in my kitchen a month after my husband's funeral and told me I needed to learn how to serve Caroline because she was the only one in this family going anywhere. You watched her mock my clothes, mock my home, and mock my daughter, and you applauded her for it. You cheered when she stood on that stage 10 minutes ago and tried to destroy my dignity in front of 200 people." My father's fake smile faltered. "Haley, be reasonable. We were just trying to push you. We wanted to build your character. We wanted you to succeed in a tough world. You wanted me to disappear." I corrected him, slicing through his lie with surgical precision. "You wanted me to be a quiet, invisible failure, so Caroline's manufactured success would look brighter. You only see me now because my net worth suddenly eclipses your wildest, most materialistic fantasies." My mother's face crumpled into a mask of genuine panic. She realized the maternal manipulation was failing. "Haley, please. She is your sister. She will lose her home. She will lose everything. You cannot be this cruel. You have the power to fix this with one word." "I have the power to do a great many things, Mother," I replied, my gaze locking onto hers with unyielding intensity. "But I will not use it to insulate my abusers from the consequences of their own toxic behavior." Caroline built a career on bullying her subordinates, mismanaging her team, and riding on the coattails of her title. Jamal built a life on stolen credit and corporate arrogance. They are exactly where they deserve to be. Mr. Harrington's decision stands. They are terminated, and they will never set foot inside an Apex building again. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, charged with the finality of my decree. My parents stared at me, their mouths agape, stripped of their power. Their favorite child ruined, and their discarded daughter standing before them as an untouchable titan. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary. I continued, my voice carrying over the dead silence of the room, reaching every guest, every executive, and my daughter, who was watching me with fierce, shining pride. It is supposed to be the one place where you are loved unconditionally, regardless of your bank account or your job title. Family isn't a place where you crush me when you think I'm poor and kiss my feet when you realize I'm rich. I turned away from their shattered faces, dismissing them entirely from my reality. I had spent my life searching for a family that would value me, only to realize I had already built one with my husband and my daughter. I did not need the toxic approval of the people standing behind me. I walked back toward Mia, the only person in the room whose love had never required a price tag. The distance between my parents and me felt like crossing an ocean, and I did not look back. I caught the eye of Vincent, the venue manager, who had been hovering near the perimeter with a team of imposing dark-suited security personnel. He immediately stood at attention, his posture rigidly professional, as he recognized the abrupt shift in the room's gravitational pull. He was no longer dealing with a passive mother of the bride trying to appease a wealthy, aggressive sister. He was taking direct, unspoken orders from the absolute apex of the corporate food chain. I gave a slight nod and raised my hand in a single, sharp gesture. Vincent crossed the floor in seconds, his security team flanking him like a well-oiled military unit. "Vincent," I said, my voice carrying the steady, immovable weight of absolute authority. "This is my daughter's wedding. It is a celebration of love, and there is no room for toxicity or abuse here. Please have these 4 individuals escorted off the premises immediately. They are trespassing, and they are no longer welcome." Vincent did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Right away, Madam Chairman." He signaled his men. 6 broad-shouldered guards descended upon the table with breathtaking efficiency. 2 guards positioned themselves squarely behind Jamal. He was still staring blankly at his declined corporate card, trapped in a waking nightmare. When a heavy hand firmly gripped his shoulder, Jamal did not fight. The last ounce of arrogant fight had been completely drained from him. He let out a hollow, defeated breath, his shoulders slumping in absolute surrender as he allowed himself to be guided toward the exit. A broken man stripped of his manufactured armor and left with nothing but his debts. My father, however, attempted to salvage a microscopic fraction of his patriarchal dominance. As a guard stepped into his personal space, he puffed out his chest, his face flushing with a volatile mix of rage and profound, crushing embarrassment. "Take your hands off me," my father barked, though his voice lacked its usual booming resonance. "I am her father. We are family. You cannot throw us out of a public venue like common criminals." "This is a private event, sir," the lead guard replied, his tone polite but entirely unyielding as he effortlessly maneuvered my father toward the aisle. "And the host has explicitly revoked your invitation. Walk, or we will carry you." My mother trailed behind them, a weeping, chaotic mess of smeared mascara and ruined dignity. She kept reaching her hands back toward me, her diamond bracelets catching the chandelier light, sobbing my name as if I were a departing lifeboat, and she was drowning in the icy water of her own consequences. She mourned the billions she had just permanently alienated, her cries echoing off the high ceilings. But Caroline did not go quietly. As 2 guards flanked her, gently but firmly grasping her upper arms, her catatonic state completely shattered. The reality of being physically removed, of being treated like an unruly, unwanted interloper at the social event of the season, triggered a complete, unhinged meltdown. The polished elite executive vanished, replaced by a cornered feral animal. Caroline let out an ear-piercing shriek that ripped through the elegant acoustics of the ballroom. She began to thrash violently, her manicured nails clawing at the empty air, her expensive designer gown catching under her heels and tearing with a loud, satisfying rip. She kicked wildly, resembling a toddler throwing a massive tantrum rather than a seasoned corporate professional. "Get your filthy hands off me!" Caroline screamed. Her face contorted into a mask of pure ugly rage. "You cannot do this to me. I am Caroline Wilson. I am a senior vice president. I am somebody." The guards simply tightened their grip, lifting her slightly off the polished hardwood floor, so her flailing legs could no longer find traction. They dragged her backward through the magnificent floral archways, her heels dragging uselessly across the imported marble foyer. The entire ballroom watched the spectacle in stunned, breathless silence. The elite guests, the prominent local politicians, the incredibly wealthy parents of the groom, all stood perfectly still, witnessing the spectacular public destruction of a woman who had spent her entire life stepping on the throats of others to appear tall. The groom's father, a man of immense old money influence, caught my eye and offered a slow, deeply respectful nod of approval. As she was hauled toward the massive oak entrance doors, Caroline locked her furious, crazed eyes on me. The last remaining veneer of civilization completely abandoned her. She spewed her final desperate venom across the quiet room, her voice scraping against the walls. "You are a cold, calculating freak!" Haley Caroline shrieked, thrashing against the unyielding grip of the security team. "You think your money makes you invincible? You think buying a holding company makes you a god? You are going to die lonely. All your billions will never buy you a real family. You hear me? You will rot in your wealth and die completely lonely." The heavy oak doors swung shut with a resounding thunderous boom, cutting off her hysterical screeching mid-sentence. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was thick, heavy, and incredibly cleansing. The toxic infection that had plagued my existence for 30 years was finally permanently excised. I stood perfectly still in the center of the dance floor, letting the quiet wash over me. I felt no regret. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the boundless expansive oxygen of total freedom. A sudden movement broke the stillness of the room. Mia did not walk. She gathered the voluminous layers of her pristine white wedding gown in her hands, completely disregarding the intricate lace and the delicate train, and she sprinted across the polished floor. She bypassed the stunned wedding party, darted past her new husband's awestruck parents, and launched herself directly at me. She crashed into my chest with a fierce, desperate, overwhelming force, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck. I caught her stumbling back a half step under her momentum and buried my face in her shoulder. She squeezed me with a strength that belied her slender frame. The room, full of billionaires, socialites, and gaping guests, melted away, leaving only the two of us anchored securely in the center of the universe. Mia pulled back just far enough to look me directly in the eyes. Her makeup was slightly smudged from her tears of pride, her expression radiating an unconditional, profound love that outshone every diamond in the building. She spoke loud enough for the front tables to hear, cementing her allegiance and her absolute awe for everyone to witness. "You are the best mother in the world," Mia declared, her voice thick with emotion but ringing with unshakable certainty. She glanced at the closed oak doors, then back to me, her smile bright and fiercely protective. "They are the lonely ones." The sheer warmth of Mia's embrace washed away the lingering chill of Caroline's venom. I held my daughter tightly, resting my chin against her beautifully styled hair, breathing in the scent of her jasmine perfume. When we finally pulled apart, the silence in the ballroom broke, not with awkward murmurs, but with a sudden resounding applause. It started from the VIP table. Arthur Harrington stood, his hands clapping in a slow, deliberate rhythm of absolute respect. Beside him, the groom's parents, the aristocratic titans of Boston real estate, who Caroline had so desperately tried to impress, joined in. The groom, a wonderful young man named Leo, rushed forward to wrap his arms around both Mia and me, cementing the reality that I was not just welcomed into their family, but revered. The orchestra, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, seamlessly transitioned into a lively, upbeat jazz standard. The tension completely evaporated, replaced by an intoxicating wave of genuine joy. Waiters reappeared with trays of vintage champagne, and the dance floor quickly filled with laughing guests. For the rest of the evening, I was not the disgraced, unemployed sister. I was the architect of the most spectacular corporate coup the city had ever seen, and more importantly, the cherished mother of the bride. Guests I had never formally met approached me with quiet awe, offering congratulations that extended far beyond the wedding itself. Arthur Harrington raised a glass to me across the room, a silent salute between equals. It was a night of unadulterated triumph, a celebration of love, loyalty, and the absolute vindication of a 30-year struggle. I danced with my new son-in-law, shared a slice of the magnificent tiered cake with my daughter, and left the venue that night feeling lighter than I had in decades. 3 months later, the crisp autumn winds swept through the city, carrying with them the inescapable, crushing reality of karma. While I was busy integrating Apex Holdings, restructuring the executive board, and expanding our philanthropic initiatives alongside Mia, the antagonists of my past were experiencing a spectacular, uninterrupted freefall. The public termination at the wedding was only the first domino in a meticulously arranged sequence of consequences. When Arthur Harrington executed their dismissal, he did not offer a quiet, graceful exit. He filed a comprehensive, highly detailed report to the board, documenting Caroline's toxic mismanagement, her history of workplace intimidation, and Jamal's gross misuse of corporate funds. Their professional records were permanently stamped with severe ethical flags. In the tight-knit, hyper-competitive world of high finance and corporate acquisitions, word travels with lethal speed. They were effectively and permanently blacklisted. Jamal, who had built his entire fragile identity on the prestige of his title and his unlimited expense account, found himself utterly unemployable. Headhunters who used to flood his inbox with lucrative offers now refused to return his frantic calls. The prestigious investment firms he aggressively attempted to pivot toward slammed their doors shut the very moment their compliance departments ran a background check. He was radioactive, a walking liability that no respectable institution would touch. Caroline fared no better. Stripped of her senior vice president status and the institutional power she wielded like a weapon, her carefully curated network of elite socialites and powerful executives abandoned her overnight. The social currency she valued above human life proved entirely counterfeit. Without their massive combined corporate income, the illusion of their untouchable wealth shattered almost immediately. The crushing reality of the New Hamptons estate mortgage came due. They had brazenly purchased the property, leveraging anticipated end-of-year bonuses that no longer existed. Within 90 days, the bank initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings. The fallout was swift and merciless. The luxury imported cars they loved to flaunt were quietly repossessed in the middle of the night from their manicured driveway. The extravagant trip to the Maldives was canceled without a refund. They were forced to list their primary residence at a severe loss, frantically selling off designer assets, watches, and jewelry to cover mounting legal fees as they vainly attempted to sue Apex Holdings for wrongful termination. It was a frivolous, desperate lawsuit that my ruthless legal team dismantled and had thrown out of court in a single afternoon, leaving them saddled with our attorney fees on top of their own. The downstream devastation hit my parents with equal ferocity. Their entire social standing had always been parasitically attached to Caroline's corporate ascent. With her very public disgrace and absolute financial ruin, my parents became instant pariahs at their beloved country club. The affluent friends they had bragged to for decades suddenly found convenient excuses to cancel dinner plans and look the other way in the grocery store aisles. Faced with the stark, terrifying reality of backing the wrong horse, their pivot to desperation was swift and entirely predictable. My private inbox became a daily repository for their groveling. They sent long, frantic, multi-paragraph emails filled with manufactured nostalgia and desperate pleas for reconciliation. My father wrote sprawling missives attempting to rewrite history, trying to reframe his lifelong cruelty as tough love designed to make me strong. He begged for a meeting, just a quick coffee to discuss family business and potential investments. My mother's emails were infinitely worse. They were saturated with cloying, tearful manipulation, insisting that a mother and daughter should never be estranged over silly misunderstandings. She hinted heavily at their own mounting financial anxieties, outlining how Caroline could no longer fund their extravagant lifestyle, and how they were counting on my legendary generosity. I sat in my spacious corner office overlooking the sprawling Boston Harbor, sipping a perfectly brewed espresso as I read their latest attempt. It was a pathetic 5-page email from my mother, recalling a supposed childhood memory of us baking together an event that had literally never happened, ending with a direct, shameless request for a substantial loan to help Caroline avoid declaring bankruptcy. I read the words, but I felt absolutely nothing. There was no residual anger, no lingering sorrow, and certainly no guilt. The emotional well from which they had constantly drawn had run completely dry. I set my coffee mug down on the polished mahogany desk. I moved the cursor over her email address, selected the drop-down menu, and clicked block. I did the exact same for my father's address, and then for Caroline's. I systematically and permanently severed the last digital threads connecting me to the people who had spent a lifetime trying to break me. The iron boundary was fully in place, impenetrable and absolute. I closed my laptop, the quiet hum of my office, a comforting testament to the profound peace I had finally secured. The harsh Boston winter eventually surrendered to a brilliant, luminous Mediterranean spring. The sterile quiet of my corporate office was traded for the rhythmic, soothing crash of the Tyrrhenian Sea against the dramatic cliffs of the Amalfi Coast. I sat on the sun-drenched terrace of our rented private villa, a sprawling historic estate wrapped in fragrant lemon groves and vibrant cascades of purple bougainvillea. A gentle, salty breeze ruffled the edges of my linen shirt as I took a slow sip of fresh espresso, looking out over the endless, glittering expanse of azure water. This trip was a delayed celebration, a joint family vacation that Leo's parents had insisted we all take to properly commemorate the merging of our lives. They had secured the estate for the entire month, allowing us to seamlessly blend our remote executive responsibilities with profound, uninterrupted relaxation. It was a luxurious sanctuary, utterly isolated from the frantic, grasping world I had permanently left behind. Footsteps padded softly against the terracotta tiles, drawing my attention away from the breathtaking coastline. Mia emerged from the villa, her hair sleep-tousled, and a bright, unburdened smile illuminating her face. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders from behind, pressing a warm kiss to my cheek before pulling out the wrought iron chair next to me. I looked at this incredible young woman now, a brilliant, confident wife, and a formidable partner in our new philanthropic foundation. The journey we had undertaken together flashed through my mind, a vivid tapestry of shared struggles, quiet sacrifices, and hard-won triumphs. I was not her biological mother. I had not given her life, but she had undeniably saved mine. When my husband passed away, he left me with a broken heart and a terrifying void, but he also left me with Mia. In the darkest depths of my grief, raising her became my singular guiding purpose. It became the anchor that kept me from drifting into total despair. Society often places an unfair, heavy stigma on the role of a stepmother. It is a relationship frequently painted with broad strokes of resentment, obligation, or inevitable distance. But looking at Mia as she poured herself a cup of coffee, I knew the absolute truth. Being a stepmother was the greatest privilege of my entire existence. It was a bond forged not by the random accident of genetics, but by a million conscious, deliberate choices. It was choosing to stay awake through childhood fevers, choosing to listen to teenage heartbreaks, and choosing to prioritize her future above my own comfort. We had chosen each other day after day, year after year, until the legal label completely dissolved, leaving only the pure, indestructible reality of motherhood. The stark contrast between the family I had meticulously built and the biological family I had escaped was staggering. My parents and my sister Caroline had relied exclusively on the accident of blood to demand my loyalty, respect, and ultimate financial salvation. They believed that simply sharing a last name gave them a blank check to belittle, exploit, and manipulate me for decades. They viewed family as a hierarchical corporation where affection was conditionally distributed based entirely on utility and social status. They chased that shallow prestige until it utterly destroyed them. The universe has a remarkable way of balancing the scales. Caroline and my parents had spent their entire lives constructing a fragile house of cards, built entirely on the validation of strangers and the superficial trappings of wealth. When the wind shifted, when the money evaporated, they had nothing solid to fall back on. They were left with the hollow reality of their own reflections. I, on the other hand, had spent my life building a foundation of bedrock. I focused on hard work, silent investments, and nurturing the relationships that actually nourished my soul. When the storm came, my foundation held firm. I had walked away from their toxic corporation and cultivated a true sanctuary. Real family is not defined by who brings you into the world. It is defined by who stands by you when your world falls apart. It is the people who celebrate your quiet victories without jealousy, who fiercely protect your peace, and who love you deeply when you have absolutely nothing to offer them but your authentic self. Leo stepped out onto the terrace balancing a silver tray of fresh pastries and local fruits. His booming laughter rang out as he joked with his mother, who followed closely behind him carrying a pitcher of fresh juice. The sound of their genuine easy joy was a massive departure from the tense, highly calculated dinners of my youth. There was no subtle maneuvering for dominance here, no cutting remarks disguised as humor, and no impossible standards to meet. There was only mutual respect, shared warmth, and effortless affection. Mia reached across the small table and took my hand, giving it a firm, reassuring squeeze. She did not need to say a single word. The quiet, profound understanding passing between us spoke volumes. We had navigated the treacherous storms, survived the cruelest betrayals, and emerged completely unscathed. We had protected our peace. I leaned back in my chair, turning my face upward to catch the morning sun. The billions of dollars sitting securely in my holding company accounts, the massive corporate acquisitions, and the unquestionable industry power I now wielded, none of it held a candle to the profound, immeasurable wealth of this exact moment. I had finally achieved the ultimate victory. I was entirely at peace, surrounded by the people who mattered most, living a genuinely beautiful life that was completely my own. Have you ever been completely underestimated by toxic family members because you didn't feel the need to show off? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of karma and standing your ground. The most profound lesson here is that true family is forged through deliberate choice, not simply genetics. Bloodlines might tie people together, but they never guarantee loyalty, respect, or unconditional support. Toxic individuals often use the facade of family obligations to manipulate and control, demanding sacrifices they would never make themselves. True sanctuary is found in the people who stand by you during your darkest moments and celebrate your victories without a hint of jealousy. You always have the absolute right to walk away from abusers and choose the family that genuinely nourishes your soul. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below.